He eluded detection for over a decade. With no clear victim profile, no clear connection to his victims, seemingly random killings spanning the entire country, and is regarded as one of the most methodical and elusive serial killers of the 21st century. A man who defied every FBI profile and left no trace when the deed was done. Yet, all the while, he was just a normal guy that no one suspected. This is the story of serial killer Israel Keyes. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded. Today, we are diving into a very infamous serial killer. I feel like a lot of people don't know a lot about, though. He is up there with my top POSs, so trigger warning there. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go mock fight down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this infamous serial killer together. You know, I spend a lot of time diving into the darkest corners of human behavior on this channel, but when I come home, my pets remind me that pure, unconditional love actually exists. And they're a very important and part of my life, and they very much help me decompress from all the darkness. And my pets deserve the world, which means they deserve the best food they can get. And that is Ollie. And for those of you who don't know, Ollie offers fresh, protein-packed meals made with real human-grade ingredients, which is an absolute win for all my dogs' health. And they also offer 5 tasty recipes, which are all slow-cooked for top nutrition, which is also a win for my dog's happiness. And these are vet nutritionist-backed recipes crafted with actual culinary experts. And the meals come perfectly portioned in mess-free packaging with a scoop and storage container, so no weird fridge smells. And plus, there's an app that lets you tap real experts for on-demand health screenings. And since switching over, my dog's coat is shinier and mealtime has become their favorite time of the day. Well, it already was before, but now they're extra excited, like their tails wag way more because they know they're getting the best meal they could ever have. And before, they used to like take a little bit of a nibble and then they kind of walk away and do stuff, but now they're just eating the meal. That's what they're completely focused on, so I can tell that they enjoy Ollie's food a lot. But your dog's well-being starts with their food, and that's why Ollie delivers fresh, human-grade food that your dog will love. So head to ollie.com/CCCM and tell them all about your dog, and use code CCCM to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. And plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. So that's ollie.com/CCCM and enter code CCCM to get 60% off your first box. Thank you so much to Ollie for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. Israel Keyes was reportedly born in Richmond, Utah on January 7th, 1978. And he was the second born to Heidi and John, or Jeff, Keyes. And his 9 other siblings included America, Autumn Rose, Charity, Hosanna, and Sunshine. Sounds like names of kids people are coming up with nowadays. I tell you what, it's just like they see something in the room and they're like, we're gonna name him Dr. Pepper. But anyway, they are getting insane and it needs to be addressed. But I digress. So Jeff, Israel's father, was once a Mormon missionary, but had largely lost faith in mainstream religion and society as a whole by the time he became a father. And Heidi and Jeff decided to raise their family in the wilderness, as they despised government interference, on top of modern medicine and public schools. So they were quite literally off the grid. So being off the grid, each of the children were delivered at their home, and self-sufficiency was a virtue. So when Keyes was around 5 years old, the family packed up and moved to an isolated plot of land in the forests of Colville, Washington. And Jeff supposedly built their cabin by hand. And initially, continuing Jeff's tradition, the family were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah, or the LDS Church. But shortly after the move to Washington, they left the LDS or Mormon faith in favor of the Christian identity movement, which is not to be confused with just Christians in general. This Christian identity movement had racist white supremacist beliefs. And Heidi and Jeff became devout followers and joined a local church called the Ark, where it was preached that white people are God's true chosen people. Okay. All right. And the church also held many anti-Semitic and anti-government views. And as you can imagine, life in the congregation was rather strict and extremist, and the children attended services that taught racial hatred. Just crazy to believe just teaching little kids how to be racist. It just doesn't click in my mind, but it's not my life. I'm reading about someone else's. So the Keyes family lifestyle did away with modern amenities and culture in an effort to uphold their religious beliefs, not unlike that of the Amish. Not saying Amish are racist bigots, by the way. They just like to live off the grid like the Amish people, and that's it. That's the only similarity there. Just want to make that very clear. Amish people, pretty awesome. So they remained cut off from society as a whole. And Keyes' childhood home in Colville was a one-room cabin that lacked running water, plumbing, and electricity. And it was so small, in fact, that many of the children had to sleep outside of the cabin in tents, regardless of weather conditions. And the Keyes kids learned that family virtue of self-sufficiency at a very young age. And they hunted wild animals for food, chopped firewood, and worked on neighboring farms for money, and to help the family out in their extreme poverty. And their everyday life was geared towards survival and necessity rather than play and proper schooling. And homeschooling was the closest thing to a formal education that they got. And while homeschooling can be very effective, my husband was homeschooled and he is a literal savant genius, that's usually only the case if the education is actually done right. Because it seems that in this particular situation, it was more about restriction than true learning. So it's like they learned the bare minimum and they were completely sheltered from the rest of the world. So it's almost like they were born and raised in a different time period. So when they got out in the real world, it was not the same thing. Bit of a shock, you could say. So as Keyes grew up, he found himself in a bubble of religious extremism through the ever-watchful eyes of his parents, and deeply influenced by the family's involvement with the Christian identity churches. But the Keyes family eventually left the Ark to join the Christian Israel Covenant Church, which Israel later described as militia-like. Sounds like a treat. And they blended more racist theology with a focus on armed training and readiness. And Israel would become proficient with guns at a very early age and learn to stockpile food and weapons. So it's a big, it's cult. It's a cult. Essentially, it's fear mongering. It's end of the world is coming. It's this one guy knows everything and only he's the guy, only God can talk to me because I know everything. And it's definitely not to get all your money and to go buy a private jet and fly off to frickin' Hawaii or something. So religious passion, racism, and a growing love of guns actively surrounded Israel. And it was also through this church and their close proximity as neighbors that the Kehoe family would become friends of the Keyes family. And the Kehoes were a physical representation of these militant ideals. Now, Shavi Kehoe, who was 5 years older than Israel, would later be arrested with his brother Cheney in 1997 after a somewhat famous incident involving a police shootout. And he was also convicted of multiple murders in which he killed a gun dealer and the dealer's wife and daughter, and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. And Keyes' close proximity to such violent individuals and ideology certainly had an effect on him. So turns out growing up in a racist militia doomsday cult isn't all that good for kids. So even in his early childhood, Israel had already begun to demonstrate concerning behaviors, because he was obsessed with guns. And by his own admission, he hunted anything with a heartbeat as a boy, killing animals of all shapes and sizes just for the thrill, not for necessity to eat, just because he liked it. Red flag number 1. And red flag number 2 is that he was no stranger to animal torture as well, because Keyes was once seen tying a cat to a tree and shooting it to death, to the horrors of those who watched. And animal cruelty is, of course, a potentially early indicator of psychopathy. And red flag number 3 was petty crimes were all too common for Israel when he was younger. And he was actually known to break into his neighbors' houses just to rob them, stealing guns and various other items. And he allegedly stockpiled these stolen weapons in a cache at his house. And when this was discovered, he was forced to return the weapons and apologize. And Keyes would also vandalize by shooting at neighbors' houses with a BB gun and setting fires in the woods. Ooh, youth arsonist, red flag number, I'm just gonna say 40 at this point. So those that had the opportunity to cross paths with this little piece of shit psychopath during his early to mid-teens noted a kind of creepiness to him. And one girl who knew him said that being around him, quote unquote, made her skin crawl. And certainly reaching over 6 feet tall in height at the age of 14 made him fairly physically imposing, which intimidated other kids. And he once bragged about skinning a deer while it was still alive. What? After which point, most of the kids from the congregation and the few neighbors he had didn't want much to do with him. Kind of crazy that, these racist, militant, doomsday weirdos are creeped out by the kid that, obviously, all the things he's doing is crazy, but even they're like, whoa, dude, that's a bit too much, okay? We're cool with being racist militants, but maybe lay off the fire, all right? So Keyes was aware of his deviance early on, and he had said that by the time he was 14, and he recognized his thoughts and behaviors weren't seen as normal by other people. So he's aware of what he's doing, and especially the incident noted before where he tortured and shot the cat, noting that people's reaction to it pushed him to spend more time to himself and mask his behaviors in the presence of others. Classic psychopath, essentially. And he said, quote, "I've known since I was 14 that there were things that I thought were normal and okay that no one else seemed to think were normal and okay. So that's when I just started being a loner. And people found out about some of the stuff I did, like my parents and parents of other kids who would hang out with me. They would find out about some of the stuff I did, and that's when I just started doing stuff by myself, exclusively," unquote. So as he continued to grow, so did his dark side, and he began to cultivate what was essentially a double life. One that would be the public-facing persona that would fit in and please his parents and those around him, and the other that would allow his darkest desires to be free and satisfied. And he tried to rationalize his violent thoughts and tendencies through his religious upbringing, attempting to place the blame on Satan or other evil powers, not taking any sort of responsibility for his actions. But ultimately, he came to terms with the belief that violence was simply part of who he was, and Keyes' strict and unforgiving home situation left him with no healthy outlet or anything to help prevent his troublesome psychopathic behaviors. And supposedly, there's a possibility that he was abused by his father as well, though this is unconfirmed. But if true, it would certainly have added all the more reason for anger and lack of empathy. So Keyes' circumstance and influences essentially molded him into a predator in training by his teen years, and he would keep his deeper fantasies secret, knowing they were socially unacceptable. And the secrecy and depth were just the beginning of what would later manifest itself into his adult life. And it's crazy to think how if he grew up around, some sort of where therapy was okay, or in a loving family, it's the nature-nurture argument. It's like, I feel like maybe a little bit of this was already in him, but the environment in which he was raised just nurtured that character, and he essentially just learned how to hide it. And obviously, I have a bias now because I know what an evil human being he became. But as a kid, I always have empathy for the kid because it's like, I feel like environment is always some sort of factor. So Keyes' family packed up and moved a couple times during his teens. And the precise timings and movement of Keyes and his family are somewhat difficult to determine from various sources, but some claim that Keyes was with his family as they moved, and others claim he went independently, and potentially not at all, so it's kind of up in the air. But regardless of timing and whether he was with them, the locations they moved to are confirmed. So in the mid to late 1990s, the Keyes family moved to Maupin, Oregon. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Which is a small desert town located directly along the Deschutes River. And it was in this town that Keyes claims he committed his first violent crime, which we'll discuss shortly. And later, the Keyes family moved near an Amish community in Smyrna, Maine. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Where they became involved in a local maple syrup business. And eventually, one of the Keyes sisters wrote that the move to Maine was part of their father's attempt to fix the older children's behavior by removing bad influences. So the parents are thankfully seeing how their children are acting and trying to change it, I guess. I mean, there's, the whole religious thing behind it and being racist and all that, but, couldn't be that. Couldn't be that. But they thought, supposedly, it wouldn't be present near the Amish community. Bad behavior, that is. But by the time the family had relocated to Maine, the Keyes had become fully disconnected from them. Yet there is evidence that he was present in the area, as at least one source mentions that there was a neighbor that called Keyes a nice, courteous young man. So this disconnect from the family arose from Keyes' departure from their tradition. And throughout his teenage years, Keyes struggled with the faith of his family. And he eventually realized that he did not share the beliefs that his parents did. And that was hard for him, considering he had worked hard to please them for so long. And whether that desire to please was legitimate or simply masking is very hard to say. But he clearly wanted some sort of validation from his parents. But by his later teens, he rebelled against them and openly renounced his faith in Christian identity. And Keyes became interested in Satanism during this period. And this led to a serious confrontation between him and his parents. And the response to his blasphemy was to exile him from their home and forbid any of his siblings from having contact with him ever again. Yet even with the loss of his family in this way, Keyes earned a sort of freedom here. And he was no longer bound by any rules, but the ones he made for himself. So he finally found some sort of independence. And he later admitted that he became an atheist. And by rejecting any sort of external morality, the stage was set for his future violent acts to come. And he reportedly had fully embraced his desire to kill by this point in his life, so his late teens, noting that it was just a matter of time before he acted on his impulses. So Keyes' first known violent crime was an SA that went unreported, and he was living in Maupin, Oregon at the time, sometime between 1996 to 1998, and decided to live out his fantasy of abducting and murdering a person. Extremely f***ed up, and his target was a young girl, estimated to be between the ages of 14 to 18, who was having a day out with friends on the Deschutes River. And according to his confession later on, Keyes watched the girl from the tree line until she was separated from her group. And he then waded out to her, grabbed her tube, and pulled her to the shore at knife point. And then he would drag her to a remote area, allegedly a campground restroom, and he would tie her up, and then he proceeded to her. And Keyes had every intention to murder this girl as part of a satanic ritual he had been fantasizing about, and he told investigators that he brought knives that he planned to use for her gruesome killing and disposal. But the girl's cries for help and attempts to humanize herself in the presence of her potential killer actually made Keyes hesitate. But thank God. What a strong woman. Like, always cry out for help. It's just, I'm so glad that she did that. And she would promise that she would never tell anyone if he just let her go. And surprisingly, her calm demeanor saved her life. And in his own words, quote, "She was pretty smart. It worked," unquote. And he released the girl and sent her back on her way to meet back up with her friends. Quote, "I was too timid. I wasn't violent enough," unquote, Keyes would later admit. And he would go on to say that he would not let that happen again. And he vowed never to let another victim escape alive. So the incident remained unreported and was most likely unknown altogether until Keyes' eventual confession. So when Keyes was 20 years old, he decided to join the Army, and he earned his GED and traveled to Albany, New York in 1998 and enlisted on July 9th. And records show that he served as a specialist while in uniform, and Keyes went through basic and then advanced infantry training, both of which he actually excelled at. Which isn't all that surprising, given he was in a militia when he was 9 years old. And he even completed the U.S. Army Rangers course, which is an elite training program focused on small unit tactics, endurance, and leadership. So he was an extremely capable soldier, fit, disciplined, and possessing great knowledge of weapons. All also the horrifying makes of a devastating serial killer. So Keyes was posted in multiple locations during his Army service from 1998 to 2001, and he first served at Fort Lewis in Washington as part of the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division on the mortar team. That was a mouthful. And later he was stationed at Fort Hood in Texas, followed by a 6-month deployment overseas to the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. And the deployment was relatively uneventful, at least from what we know, though Keyes was able to make friends and travel the region, reportedly patronizing ladies of the night during his time on leave, though. And his peers noted that he seemed to do really well with the regimented lifestyle that the Army provided, showing no obvious signs of the darkness that would later be revealed, at least not while they were on duty. So outside of his excellent performance, Keyes' demeanor as a soldier was generally quiet and withdrawn, and he tended to keep to himself on base and didn't really cause any trouble. That is, until the weekend came around. And he was known to be a heavy drinker when he was off duty, and he allegedly would finish entire bottles of Wild Turkey, which is his favorite bourbon. And there were some subtle signs that Keyes possessed the capacity for violence that showed themselves in the Army and were most likely just overlooked at the time. And at one point, while deployed in Egypt, he allegedly told another soldier that he would, quote-unquote, would like to kill him. Red flag number 152. And while in custody years later, he confessed to allegedly attempting to a lady of the night and a college student he met while deployed. And he also really loved insane clown pose and had large posters of the group posted in the barracks. And though not necessarily an indicator of violence, the group's music does have violent references, and some sparked some controversial discussion over whether or not it incites actual violence. Which I don't know if that's the case. I feel like people who are violent will gravitate towards violent music, and it'll just, it's just something they like because they're already like that. I don't think music really makes you that way. But what do I know? I don't know. But his only major run-in with the law was when he was arrested for DUI in February of 2001, and his record was clean other than that. And one of his Army friends later noted that Keyes' dark side would show when he drank. But of course, at the time, none of these things were connected to any criminal activity. At worst, his antics were most likely viewed as simply blowing off some steam. So Keyes' service would come to an end when he was honorably discharged from the Army on July 8th, 2001 at Fort Lewis. And on paper, his military career was exemplary, and he received several awards, including Army Achievement Medal recognizing his service as a gunner or assistant gunner, an Army Service Ribbon, a Marksman Badge with Rifle Bar, an Expert Infantryman Badge, an Air Assault Badge. So now that the chapter with the Army had finished, Keyes returned to civilian life. But his military experience had provided him with skills with handling weapons even better than he did when he was 9 years old, and utilizing stealth and extreme endurance, all of which came in handy for realizing his very dark desires. So Keyes made his way back to Washington State, starting his next chapter of life on the Makah Indian Reservation in Nia Bay. And he lived with Tammy Hawkins, a woman that he had met and begun dating while stationed at Fort Lewis. And Tammy was a member of the tribe, and by the time Keyes discharged, she was pregnant with his child. And Tammy gave birth to Lainey in late 2001, and Keyes led what was, by all appearances, a very stable life as a loving father and supportive partner for the next 6 years, which is just crazy to imagine. I mean, I just think of, John Wayne Gacy and BTK and Ed Camper, all these people that are like capable of living double lives. It blows my mind, but Israel was absolutely one of them. So Israel worked for the Makah Tribal Council and was known as a reliable handyman. And he seemed to welcome domestic life, as neighbors recall him as polite and a quiet man who was kind and helpful. Yet, unknown to those around him, his darker side was ever present and growing much stronger amidst the mask of a normal life. So no longer bound to the structured life of the army and living far from anyone who really knew him, Keyes found the freedom he needed to finally begin his killing fantasies. And he later admitted that he started killing people in 2001, shortly after moving to Neah Bay. And he claimed that between 2001 and 2006, that he murdered at least 4 people in Washington state, all of which were crimes that were never connected or figured out. And Keyes also implied that he killed someone in 2001 around Neah Bay and either buried or submerged the body in a remote location. But the body was never found in a related search, but was ruled an accidental death. And one of the murders was a double homicide, and Keyes alleged that he abducted and killed a young couple somewhere between 2001 and 2005. And he said that he beat the male victim to death with a shovel and strangled the female victim, then buried both bodies in an undisclosed location. And these identities are still unknown, and no matching missing persons case has been linked. And the other murders were of 2 individuals in separate incidences around 2005 and 2006. And one of the victims' bodies was disposed of in Lake Crescent, but this body was never recovered either. And Keyes did not give the names of these victims, and none of them have been identified nor connected to Keyes in any meaningful way. So these initial murders went under the radar of authorities because Keyes was very careful about his victims' selection, and he chose random victims and left minimal, if any, evidence. All the while, he continued living his life, giving no indication to anyone around him that he was now a murderer. And investigators do believe that his first murder likely occurred in that first summer Keyes was in Neah Bay, and the FBI continues to look into open cases in Washington and the surrounding areas from this time frame, just attempting to use Keyes' travel history as a guide. And when asked why he committed the murders in Neah Bay, he replied, quote, "Neah Bay's a boring town," unquote. What a f***ing monster. But these are all murders that potentially happened, but were never actually verified. So as Keyes began realizing his desires, he spent a ton of time studying other serial killers and understanding how to avoid their mistakes. And he pored over case studies and FBI publications, and he read books and articles, and he became intimately familiar with how profilers worked, and he greatly admired other killers who traveled like he did. And one in particular that Keyes was fond of was none other than Ted Bundy, who he considered an influence. And Bundy also masked his true self for years and traveled between states to kill. And Keyes' approach to murder became obsessively calculated and methodical. And one of the biggest realizations of the risks of serial killers was holding on to weapons or souvenirs that could tie them to the crimes they commit. And also committing said crimes near where they lived, adding themselves to the suspect pool by proximity. And to combat this, he began crafting and burying kill kits around the country. And these were caches that he used to hide weapons, ammo, cash, zip ties, chemicals to dissolve bodies, and other tools. He was doing what he did as a little kid when he stole stuff from the neighbor's house and put them in a cache, which is essentially a place where you just store items that are usually hidden. So he was just, by all accounts, like the most premeditated murderer I've ever heard of. He was hiding caches in places where he wasn't even looking for victims at that point yet. He was just knowing that eventually he would, but he was just doing that so he wouldn't get caught. It's just, the methodology of Israel Keyes is absolutely insane. So the cache would be plastic buckets or bins, and he would place them in secret locations so he could dig them up whenever he wanted them for a murder. And inside these buckets were the weapons and chemicals and anything that he would want to murder someone. And thanks to this level of pre-planning, he could simply arrive in an area and already have everything he needed for the kill. No need for suspicious purchases or carrying incriminating items while traveling. And sometimes these caches were buried years before being used. Again, the level of evil, and this obviously being the number one thing he thinks about all the time, is just, it's insane. Like, for example, one that he planted in Essex, Vermont in 2009, he didn't use until 2011 for the Courier murders, which we will talk about shortly. And he hid kits in several states across the US, some of which were discovered after Keyes disclosed their locations, and many of which have yet to be found. So there's still God knows how many caches, Israel Keyes caches out there in the United States. And Keyes stuck to a few rules that helped him avoid detection. He never killed close to home, and he never killed in the same area more than once, unless during the same murder. And he intentionally crossed jurisdictions to take advantage of the informational gaps between law enforcement agencies, especially at the time. Because it's gotten better and better over the years, but even in the 90s and early 2000s, it was still a bit dodgy. So his crimes were so scattered both in location and time that a single killer was never suspected. And in order to fund his future murderous pursuits, Keyes committed a string of bank and home robberies to steal money and various other items to sell. And at least 2 of these bank robberies were confirmed. One in Tupper Lake, New York in April of 2009, and the other one in Azul, Texas in February 2012. And the stolen funds were used to pay for airline tickets, rental cars, gas, and any and all other expenses accrued in the murder of innocent people. But he also had a legitimate construction business, which also provided extra funds that helped his process. So Keyes' relationship with Tammy had begun to fall apart in 2006, and the couple parted ways, though Laney would split time between the two of them. And not long after, he began a new relationship with a woman named Kimberly Anderson around 2007, and she was a nurse practitioner from Alaska, and the relationship progressed fairly quickly, turning serious after a very short time. And when Kimberly decided to move back to Alaska for work, Keyes decided to follow. So Keyes and Laney moved along with Kimberly to Anchorage, Alaska, where they settled into the city's Turn Again neighborhood, which was home to many professionals and a state superior court judge. And Keyes immediately got to work starting up a business, and he founded Keyes Construction to make use of his extensive construction and handyman skills, and advertised himself as a reliable contractor for home projects. And he built decks and fences and remodeled kitchens and more. And clients viewed him as competent and efficient, earning himself a good reputation for his craftsmanship in the community. And he continued to uphold his former image of adoring father and devoted partner once again, even though now that was different with a different partner. But Keyes spoke lovingly about his daughter to coworkers and neighbors. And the family had pet pugs who were well taken care of, and Keyes had even built a special ramp for them so they could easily walk from the back porch down into the yard. So by all accounts, they just appeared like a very normal, nice family, which just makes all of this extra horrifying. And people who interacted with Keyes knew him as friendly, yet just like an unremarkable guy, because he worked really hard to not draw too much attention to himself. And he was generally polite and just soft-spoken. And a local attorney who hired him for his handyman services said, quote, "I never got any bad or weird, scary, odd vibe from him in any way, shape, or form," unquote. He was just seen as dependable and spent lots of time caring for Laney, often taking her on trips. And Keyes also loved the outdoors, which is not uncommon for people in Alaska, because he loved fishing, he loved hiking and kayaking and camping. And his apparent passion for being in the wild and his survival skills helped him fit right into Alaskan culture. And anyone who knew him recognized the importance he placed on his family relationship, which is why so many were at a loss for words when his crimes would eventually come to light. But beneath that nice, normal guy exterior, Keyes continued to indulge in his dark fantasies. And between 2007 and 2012, his time in Anchorage specifically, he executed some of his most carefully planned and far-reaching murders. Extending that time frame to include a few extra years, he traveled extensively from October 2004 to March 2012 with at least 35 multi-state trips, many of which were to hunt for victims. And his strategy for these trips was a well-oiled machine, as he would fly to a given location, rent a car nearby, and then drive hundreds or thousands of miles to his target area. So this just separated his place of entrance from the crime scene and the crime. And he also paid for everything in cash and removed the battery from his cell phone to prevent it from being tracked. And on the road, Keyes carefully made sure he kept a low profile. And it worked, as he was able to travel between multiple states throughout these years completely under the radar of the authorities. And oftentimes, he would combine family visits and vacations with scouting for his next victims and prepping for the deed. And in retrospect, it's unclear if these visits and trips actually served the dual purpose of seeing family and relaxing while scouting, or if the sole purpose was to scout while hiding that intention. And when the FBI finally mapped out the totality of Keyes' travels, they found that unsolved murders and disappearances seemed to align, and Keyes was very patient when looking for his victims, waiting for just the right moment of opportunity. And he preferred places like campgrounds, parks, and cemeteries or boating docks, as they were very remote, quiet places where potential victims could be alone. And he'd stake out these areas sometimes for days, holding out for that perfect person to come along. And Keyes said that he would usually let the victim come to me by selecting spots that people naturally passed through but were usually isolated. And if he was proactive and scouting houses, he chose easily accessible locations with avoidable security and no additional people, like children or watchful neighbors or dogs to alert. An opportunity was the driver here rather than the specific type of victim, because he did not discriminate on that person, just that the time was right with no one to witness. And because of this specifically, he had no consistent victim profile, at least in the traditional sense. And the victims varied in age, gender, and ethnicity. And he later claimed that he had a specific rule against harming children, which allegedly arose from his daughter. And it's true that no confirmed victims were children, but many remain unsure if this was genuine or part of Keyes' just games that he loved to play. And Keyes also made sure to fully cover his tracks, and he disposed of bodies in secluded areas, sometimes sinking them in bodies of water or using chemicals to dissolve them. And as mentioned before, he didn't hold on to keepsakes like the murder weapon or items from the victims, and made sure they were removed and never found. And though Israel effectively hid his criminal life, he still had his demons in his personal life. And he never quite kicked his drinking habit from the army, and that was coupled with severe bouts of seasonal depression, especially being in Alaska where it's dark a lot of the time. And this naturally took a toll on his relationship with Kimberly, and the two would split sometime in 2011. But before the split, there was allegedly an evening in which Kimberly took the bottle away from Keyes and he threatened to you-know-what to himself because of it. And he later admitted to spending time with ladies of the night at some point during his travels, and even potentially in Alaska. Though he never confessed to specifically murdering a lady of the night, the FBI did have their suspicions considering his patterns. Yet even with these struggles, friends and neighbors would never have guessed that these were more than just hiccups in an otherwise well-adjusted individual. Bill and Lorraine Currier were a married couple in their 50s, living in Essex, Vermont. And Bill was an animal care technician known for his love and dedication to helping animals, as well as always offering a hand to neighbors. And Lorraine worked at Fletcher Allen Healthcare and was known and loved for her caring demeanor and patience. And they had lived a quiet and happy life together since their marriage in 1985. And they had no children of their own, but took special care of their pets. And they were the sort of people who loved their jobs and never missed work without notice. So Keyes targeted the Curriers at random on June 8, 2011, based on the fact that their house had an easy way to enter through the garage. And some sources also note he was looking for a place that had a couple living in it with no kids and no dogs. And he flew from Alaska to Chicago just a few days prior, rented a car, and then drove over 1,000 miles to Vermont in search of his next victims. He was the epitome of a patient serial killer. And this is the location I mentioned before that Keyes had buried one of his kits a couple years prior. So on the night of the 8th, Keyes went up to the house wearing a headlamp and carrying a gun. And he first cut their phone line and disabled their alarm system. And then he broke a window to get into the attached garage and made his way into the main house from there. And the couple was asleep in their bed. And he woke them up at gunpoint to subdue them with zip ties for their wrists. and they obeyed his demands despite their fear. And Keyes did allow them to get dressed and put their slippers on to help them get over the glass as he moves them to their 1996 Saturn. And then he drove them in their car to an abandoned farmhouse that he had chosen earlier as the murder spot. So grabbing Bill, he dragged him into the house and bound him downstairs. And as he did, Lorraine tried to escape, but he chased her down and brought her inside as well, but to a separate area. And Bill kept calling out, quote unquote, "Where's my wife?" After which Keyes shot him to death. And he then focused on Lorraine, and he would first SA her and then move on to strangling her, which would knock her unconscious at some point. And when she woke up again, she again fought for her life, which Keyes later noted that she was quote unquote feisty. But in the end, he strangled her to death. And after he committed the murders, Keyes placed their bodies in trash bags and hid them under debris. And he poured Drano on top of their bodies to try and decompose them quicker, and then drove the courier's car to an apartment complex, abandoned it, and returned to get his rental car. And he allegedly stole a handgun from the courier's residence, which he hid with his own weapon and remaining materials back into the cache and placed it in a reservoir in Parishville, New York. So the next day, when Bill and Lorraine both failed to show up to work, coworkers immediately knew something was wrong. And police went to their home and saw signs of home invasion, including the broken glass and cut phone line and missing car and personal gun. But both Lorraine's glasses and Bill's insulin were still in the house, which was odd. And a major search and investigation would begin, but no solid leads could be found at the time. And their abandoned car was found a few days later, but it offered very few clues. And the case would go cold, and it wasn't until Keyes' later confession that the truth would come to light. But their bodies would never be recovered. And the farmhouse that was the scene of the crime was demolished, and the debris was sent to a landfill before police ever knew it took place there. And a statement was released in honor of Bill and Lorraine's bravery that night, saying, quote, "They fought to the end," unquote. So Samantha Koenig was a barista from Anchorage, Alaska, born on August 30th, 1993. She was a smart and sociable young woman known for her warm smile and bubbly personality. And she had grown up in Anchorage and had dreams of joining the Navy to become a nurse. And she was dating a young man named Dwayne and living with her dad, James, who believed the world revolved around her. So Samantha worked the late shift at the small roadside coffee shop known as Common Grounds. And she did that to earn money that she put towards her dream as she figured out her next steps in life. And for whatever reason, Keyes decided to break his own rule on February 1st, 2012, and abduct Samantha on his own turf. So that evening, she was working the stand alone, and just before 8 p.m., after closing time, Keyes came up to the window wearing a ski mask and ordered a coffee. And as Samantha turned around to hand him the drink, Keyes pulled out a gun, and he told her it was a robbery and asked her to turn off the lights. And once she did, he climbed through the window and bound her hands. And then he led her across the street towards his white pickup truck, but she attempted to escape. And that's when Keyes would tackle her and threaten her with the gun to force her cooperation, which she gave and walked with him to the truck. All the while assuring her that this was for a ransom and that he wasn't going to hurt her in order to keep her calm. And he then realized that Samantha's cell phone was still back at the stand, so he went back to get it, and also took the cash from the register and locked up the stand. So with Samantha's cell in his hands, he sent a text to her boyfriend and her employer to give them the impression that she needed to get out of town for a few days in an attempt to stop them from looking for her. And Keyes then drove her to his property and brought her to a small shed behind the main house. And there, he would SA Samantha and strangle her to death. And he would reveal in his confession that he killed her just hours after the abduction, and then left her body there to go back into the house and be with Kimberly and Lainey as if nothing had happened, because at this point, they were still together. And a few hours later, Keyes and Lainey left for a cruise out of New Orleans. And they flew into Texas together and then drove to New Orleans for the cruise. So Samantha's family reported her missing when Dwayne found the coffee stand abandoned and received the suspicious text. And a massive search began for her along with the FBI investigation, but no one suspected Keyes even slightly. And surveillance footage had caught only a masked figure, and the text had misled people to believe it was someone she knew, or perhaps she did just leave on her own. And as the search for Samantha escalated, Keyes enjoyed himself on a leisurely trip like the piece of shit he is. And he returned from vacation on February 17th to find that the case was still a hot topic. So he decided to see if he could get a ransom out of her loved ones. And he took her body out of the shed, which was still there the entire time he was on vacation, with Kimberly still at the house, but it had been preserved from the cold, and he would put makeup on her face and sew her eyelids open to make her appear still living. And then he would prop her up, and he would grab a recent copy of the Anchorage Daily News and held it up next to her and took a picture. And the ransom note demanded $30,000 to be put into Samantha's bank account for her, quote-unquote, safe return. And Keyes texted Dwayne on February 24th about the location of the note. So desperate at the very thought that she could still be alive, the family raised the funds through community help and some savings and deposited the money. The exact amount seems to vary between sources, some claiming the full amount, others like a partial amount of $5,000 into her account. But right after the photo, Keyes would dismember her remains and sink them into the Matanuska Lake, hoping her body was never to be found. Or at least not until the water thawed in the spring. And with the ransom money now safely in her account, Keyes felt a surge of confidence, though perhaps misplaced. And he set off on another trip, and this time through the Southwest, using Sarah's debit card to withdraw the cash along the way. And the withdrawals were obviously caught on ATM cameras showing a disguised man. But one of them caught a glimpse of a Ford Focus, a rare mistake for Keyes. So police and the FBI would eventually recover Samantha's remains in early April, and hundreds of people would gather around for her celebration of life on the 22nd at West High School in Anchorage. And the murder itself deeply shook the city because the coffee stand was a regularly visited location, highlighting the severe flaws of the current public safety. And a memorial plaque was placed at the Matanuska Lake in Samantha's honor, dedicated to her and eventually to all the victims of Keyes. And she is remembered as a young woman full of life, cut too short by an absolute monster. But at this point, Israel Keyes was still a free man. Deborah Feldman was a 49-year-old woman from Hackensack, New Jersey, and she vanished under mysterious circumstances on April 8, 2009, after having last been seen at her home. And her case had long been unsolved, and she was considered a missing person. But after his capture, Keyes told the FBI that he murdered a woman on the East Coast and buried her body in upstate New York in 2009. And though he never explicitly said her name, as was common for him to leave victims unnamed, he gave enough clues that led the FBI investigators to become relatively confident that Deborah was the victim. And Keyes' statements, along with cell phone records and travel records, line up with her disappearance. And he was known to be retrieving a cache in that area at the time, and reportedly, when shown a picture of Deborah, he replied, quote, "I'm not ready to talk about that one," unquote. And Deborah's body has not yet been found, but the FBI officially considers her a likely victim, effectively making her Keyes' fourth confirmed victim. And searches have been conducted, and investigators still hope that her remains may be found by unsuspecting hikers or loggers someday. But the case remains open until then. But it's of note that Keyes seemed to be guarded when asked about specific unsolved cases, because it was clear that he didn't want to give away everything that he did, potentially leaving some of his murders forever missing the key to conclusively being tied to him. And one case in particular that seemed to draw attention regarding Keyes was the disappearance of 12-year-old Julie Harris from Colville, Washington on March 3rd, 1996. And she was a Special Olympics athlete who had 2 prosthetic feet that were found in a nearby river, and her remains were found in the woods in April of 1997. And the case was unsolved. And Keyes was allegedly living in the area at the time. At the very least, it was an area he grew up in. And when he was questioned about it, he never admitted to the murder, but he mentioned that he had heard about that. And investigators viewed his lack of willingness to say more as suspicious. and the case hasn't been linked to Keys necessarily, but he remains a possible suspect. And then there's Susan Lyle, who was a 19-year-old college student who disappeared on March 2nd, 1998 from the State University of New York at Albany campus after her shift at Babbage's computer store. And she allegedly took a bus back to campus, got off near her dorm where she was last seen, but she was never seen again. And she was reported missing the next day, but her credit card was used that afternoon to take out $20. And her boyfriend said that they were the only two that knew the PIN for the card, but his alibi checked out, though he was never truly ruled out as a suspect due to his later lack of cooperation with authorities. And Key's role in this comes from the coincidence that Suzanne's disappearance happened just before his enlistment into the army in April, but there are no direct links to him other than this circumstantial timing, and this case remains unsolved. And then there's Giovanna Tyler, who disappeared in March 2004 after last having been seen at her home. And the 29-year-old native Alaskan woman had a husband and 4 children, though the relationship with said husband was allegedly strained at the time. And he has been cooperative with authorities. And Key's relation to this disappearance is that Tyler was allegedly at the Nia Bay police station at the same time he was, just a month before her disappearance. So the chance overlap led investigators to ask Keys about it, and he neither confirmed nor denied being involved in that case. And the case is still unsolved, and he still remains a suspect. And then there was 52-year-old Randy Gorenberg, who was taken from a Boca Raton, Florida shopping center in broad daylight on March 23, 2007. And she was discovered shot to death later that day, and her death is the first in a series of 3 crimes committed by the Boca killer. And the second crime was the kidnapping of an unnamed woman and her toddler son from the same shopping center on August 7, 2007. And she was able to catch a glimpse of her killer, though he wore a mask, and described him as a tall man with long hair and athletic build, generally matching Key's appearance. But she was released from the situation unharmed. And then the third crime was the murder of 47-year-old Nancy Bochicchio and her 7-year-old daughter, Joey Bochicchio Hauser. And they were killed in the parking lot of a shopping center in their car on December 12, 2007. And there was no direct evidence tying Keys to these crimes, but the sketch provided by the victim that got away bears a striking resemblance to Keys, leading some to consider him as a suspect. And then a week after Keys murdered Samantha Koenig, a 58-year-old man named Jimmy Tidwell disappeared in Texas after his night shift as an electrician. And in one of the confirmed bank robberies that Keys committed, he allegedly wore a hard hat and hair that resembled Tidwell's hard hat and hair. And this led to the theory that Keys crossed paths with Tidwell, killed him, and took his hat and hair to use as a disguise. And again, no direct evidence ties Keys to the disappearance other than the familiar disguise, and he was in Texas around that time. And Tidwell's case is still unsolved. So the FBI believes that Keys ultimately murdered 11 people in total based on the evidence that they have, including interviews and travel records. And another bit of evidence is the drawing of 11 skulls Keys made with his own blood, along with a pentagram in his cell. And the FBI views each skull as representing one of his victims, using the fact that Keys claimed at one point that he had killed, quote-unquote, less than a dozen people. And they have publicly stated, quote, "We believe that 11 is the total number of victims," unquote. And some authorities believe that the number could be higher, citing that Keys did travel internationally and hinted that he may have killed outside of the country, but there is no concrete evidence of this. And Keys remained in control of that information he provided about certain crimes, intentionally withholding details for victims that could potentially be identified because he is an evil person. And this seemingly stemmed from his concern about protecting his mom and daughter from learning of his crimes and possible publicity they may receive. So as mentioned earlier, Samantha Koenig's disappearance set a massive search and investigation. And Keys' ransom note and the deposit of the ransom money into Samantha's account immediately flagged the account as a point of interest for the FBI to watch shortly after the deposit. And Samantha's debit card was used to withdraw $500, allegedly the daily limit for the account, in Anchorage. And the withdrawal activity then moved out of state, next in Willcox, Arizona on March 7th, and then onto New Mexico, and then into Texas on March 12th. But unbeknownst to Keyes, who was usually more careful than to involve himself with anything other than cash, every time he used an ATM with the card, the FBI was notified and informed local authorities to be on the lookout. And then came his biggest slip-up, which was the captured footage of his rental car, the Ford Focus that we were talking about before. Because he had still been careful to use a disguise at every ATM he visited, but somehow the camera angle of one ATM managed to record his rental car, which gave authorities a bit of information that massively helped narrow the search, and a bulletin was circulated amongst law enforcement in eastern Texas. So on March 13th, 2012, a Texas Highway Patrol corporal named Brian Henry saw a white Ford Focus matching the bulletin's description in Lufkin, Texas. And Corporal Henry, along with nearby Texas Ranger Stephen Rayburn, pulled the vehicle over in the parking lot of a Cotton Patch Cafe, and allegedly because the driver had been speeding. Interesting, the same way Ted Bundy got caught. The parallels. And that driver was none other than Keyes himself. And they noticed that Keyes acted calm but seemed on edge. And when they searched his vehicle, they discovered cash with bright dye and clothes matching the disguise from the ATM footage, and Samantha's cell phone, debit card, and driver's license. So Keyes was immediately arrested and taken into custody on fraud charges from the stolen debit card. And within days, he was extradited back to Alaska. So while in custody, Keyes was confronted with the mountain of evidence connecting him to Samantha's abduction. And reportedly, he had initially denied involvement with claiming her belongings were tossed into his car via open window. Okay, you moron.
You know you're under arrest. You know you're not free to leave. You know what you're under arrest for. Okay.
But in the face of this confrontation, he confessed to Samantha's murder on April 2nd, providing information that only the perpetrator would know. And in exchange for certain amenities like cigars and coffee, and he agreed to tell investigators where her remains were hidden, like we talked about before, where the FBI found them. It's because Israel told them in April. And if he didn't, I don't think that they ever would have found her remains. And as we know, they were recovered exactly where he described. And though horrific, this provided her family with some closure. And on April 18th, 2012, an Alaskan federal grand jury formally indicted Keyes for the kidnapping resulting in death of Samantha Koenig, and for bank fraud from the use of her debit card. And because he crossed state lines in the commission of his crimes, it fell under federal jurisdiction, which meant the possibility of the death penalty. And had it solely been committed in Alaska, the state does not have a death penalty, eliminating it as an option. But at the time, the public was still wholly unaware of the true extent of Keyes' crimes, as authorities kept his confessions hidden for months as they tried to get as much information out of him as possible. So Keyes was interviewed for more than 40 hours by a team of FBI agents, police detectives, and federal prosecutors from April to December of 2012. And the sessions were recorded, and several have been released. And he attempted to negotiate a deal for himself from the very start, because before he would cooperate, he wanted assurances on a few key demands. One, that he would avoid trials, or at least avoid being tried multiple times in multiple jurisdictions. And two, that his daughter's identity would be kept out of the public and that family members would be spared distressing details. And he pushed for a swift death penalty, because he had no interest in living out his days in jail. So he just made sure that he always felt that he was in the driver's seat for these interviews. And Keyes' requests were listened to by the prosecuting team, but no firm promises were made, as sentencing is extremely complex and would be up to a judge and jury.
Because I may have some options as far as that goes. How to get you at least some information without...
Well, and that's what we tried to give you. We tried to give you that ability.
Yeah, that was our idea.
The plan was, you tell us, where in New York, so we can work with them and get their assurances, and then more you starting those processes. But we just need to move them forward a little bit. It doesn't.
No.
But they did at least agree to some smaller things in an effort to keep him talking. For example, they agreed not to immediately release certain details to help protect his family's privacy, and at times he allegedly grew impatient with the lack of his demands being met, but he never fully stopped talking until the end, because that's how these guys are. They're just like pathetic, narcissistic, psychopathic idiots. And the concern for his daughter and his mother is something that many are intrigued by, especially in light of his supposed rule that he would not harm children. And he repeatedly mentioned that he did not want his mother or daughter to hear or read about the gruesome aspects of his crime. Boo-hoo, motherfucker. Consequences for your actions. So this concern very well could have been genuine, but equally as likely could have simply been a ploy to maintain control and influence people's perception of him. Or maybe even a mix of both. But still, for someone displaying psychopathic tendencies, it's something of note. One of the very few glimpses of potential remorse that Keyes showed, though only geared towards his own family and not actual remorse for any of his actions against innocent human beings. And in the end, no formal deal was actually ever signed. And the death penalty was on the table, but the timeline wasn't fast enough for Keyes, which he expressed frustration towards in his final months. And the repeated small favors for information like coffee, candy, and cigars showed just how desperate authorities were to learn what he was hiding. But once he began talking, he finally revealed the many crimes and related information that we've talked about throughout this video, including initially confessing to killing at least 8 people, the Courier murders, the 4 victims in Washington, and 1 in New York, believed to be Deborah Feldman and Samantha Koenig. And he hinted to more, but the closest we got to a final number was the clue he had told FBI regarding less than a dozen. And he kept most names to himself, but he did at least provide the names of Bill and Lorraine Courier and gave specific non-public details confirming he was, in fact, the killer. And he discussed his methods, including caches in detail and the study of serial killers, including his appreciation of Bundy. And he admitted to the confirmed bank robberies and arson as well. And when asked about remorse, he demonstrated that he felt absolutely none for what he had done. No regret or empathy for his victim, only potentially the impact it might have on his family. And he confirmed the essay of the teenage girl in Oregon, which was his first violent crime. And he also confessed to stalking multiple targets that he ultimately did not follow through attacking, including one scenario in which he was about to kill a couple at sniper's range, but a police officer showed up and started talking to them like a guardian angel. And he resolved to kill the police officer as well until a second one arrived, at which point he backed off. But Keyes was incredibly calculated with his responses and the information he revealed in these interviews, almost toying with interrogators, and he regularly held back information and enjoyed the sense of power that it gave him. And at one point, he even laughed as they became frustrated with him, saying, quote, "This is entertainment for me," unquote. Asshole, I swear to God. And if he ever felt like his wishes weren't going to be honored in regards to information he gave, he quickly would shut down until he received assurances. So the back and forth certainly played with interviewers' emotions, and he truly enjoyed keeping them guessing, rarely providing enough information to actually act upon with any level of certainty. And even to the straightforward question of how many people he had killed, he bounced back and forth without ever giving a solid answer to stick with. So on May 23rd, 2012, Keyes attempted to escape during a routine courtroom appearance. Similar to Ted Bundy. This guy doesn't even have his own personality. He's just copying another guy. What a pathetic loser. Not that Ted Bundy isn't, he also is, but my gosh. But he would break free from his leg bindings and leapt over the courtroom railing, darting towards the exit. And he caught those in the courtroom off guard, but he wasn't quite quick enough and was brought down by authorities with a taser. And this led to even tighter security for him at future hearings. But this was likely just a foreshadowing of his future plan. Keyes had no intention of remaining in custody or serving his eventual sentence. So Keyes' trial was scheduled for March 2013, 1 year after his arrest. And while awaiting the trial, he was detained in a high-security cell at Anchorage Correctional Complex. Yet despite being under close watch, he was found dead in his cell on December 2nd, 2012 at the age of 34. And it's unclear how he managed it, but but Keyes somehow acquired razor blades, and you can put two and two what he did with those. And not only did he use those, but he would also tie together bed sheets, and you can imagine what he did with those. And guards failed to notice until it was too late, and Keyes was dead. So among the things found in Keyes' cell after his death was a 4-page note written with a combination of pencil and ink on a yellow pad, and it was located underneath his lifeless body, and it was illegible and bloodstained. And the note was sent to the FBI lab in Virginia for processing, but it was concluded that there was no hidden message or meaning in the note about victims. But the note did seem to be Keyes' ode to murder, and in it, he criticized American society and values, calling out their obsession with meaningless things like reality TV, vanity, and the mindless 9-to-5 grind just to end up in a retirement home someday. And he also seemed to celebrate his murders through poetry with lines like, quote, "Your wet lips were a promise of a secret unspoken, nervous laugh as it burst like a pulse of blood from your throat. There will be no more laughter here," unquote. Just furthering the sentiment he felt in life. There was no remorse shown in the note for his crimes as he passed into death. And also found in his cell were the 11 skull and 1 pentagram drawings found underneath his bed, drawn with his own blood. And each skull was almost childlike in form. And one of them had the words, "We are one," written beneath it. And as mentioned before, these skulls are what led investigators to believe that Keyes ultimately had 11 victims, one to match each skull. And the "we are one" could mean many things, but it possibly meant that now, with his death, he was able to join them and be unified. Or maybe that he viewed all of the victims as part of his legacy, and the drawings represent that. But obviously there's no way to know for certain that he's gone now, adding yet another mystery he left behind. And these skulls were not revealed until May of 2020, when the FBI released them in hopes that it may help identify more of his victims. But Keyes' death caught authorities by surprise, because he had been actively talking during interview sessions and seemed engaged when he was doing so in the weeks prior. And his cooperation certainly didn't scream that he would be dead very soon. And frustratingly, it left more questions unanswered than answered, and cut off authorities from essentially the only source that could give information regarding the crimes, as Keyes had done such a good job at concealing what he had done. And his death was a cruel outcome for the victims' families. And for the ones that were confirmed, they were denied justice in that Keyes took the easy way out, in that Keyes took that from them. And for those unconfirmed, perhaps they'll never truly know what becomes of their loved ones. And the way in which Keyes died leaves suspicion and raises suspicion as well, considering he was supposedly a highly watched inmate, and his death left so many involved in the case with a sense of unfinished business. And knowing that there are victims out there who now may never be identified to bring closure to their families is beyond frustrating. But as of today, investigators are still looking into the case and any of Keyes' potential victims. But as of right now, that is where the case stands today. So that is that for this video. I hope Israel Keyes is burning in a special place, a special, hot, horrible place in hell as we speak. And my heart goes out to every single family that was affected by this, and all of the victims and unidentified victims as well, because I feel like I know in my heart that there was so many more than what we know about. If you have any other cases you would like me to deep dive into, let me know down below. I always read the comments, and I will see your beautiful face in the next video. Okay, stay safe. Thank you. Bye.
Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I like to talk about, and I know you do too, you sick-minded, intellectual, beautiful-minded freak. I forgot what I usually say, and my mustache fell off. Today, we will be covering Do I have hair in my mouth? Oh, I do. Today, we are going to be covering 3 bone-chilling Canadian murders that I am certain you have not heard about. And not just any murders, but multiple murders, aka serial killers. So let's unbuckle your seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into these Canadian crime cases together. But before we get into the video, I'd like to thank today's awesome sponsor, which is Raycon. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. As you guys know, I am a big Raycon proponent. Not only because they are extremely affordable, but because they produce high quality sound that other premium brands do, but with an affordable price. And I use Raycons quite literally every single day, whether I'm just sitting on the couch drawing while listening to music, or I'm out on a walk with my doggo, or on a run, which is less frequent, or just traveling wherever. Because the Raycon everyday earbuds are made to make your everyday a lot easier. And what's great about them also is that they have 32-hour battery life and multi-point connectivity that lets you pair it with 2 devices at once. There's also active noise cancellation, which makes my flights a lot easier when I can tune out the babies crying in the background. And they have a variety of very vibrant colors, so you can customize your Raycons to your own style. I love the cases that they have for them that you can just take off and put on. I have a couple different ones, but this one has been my favorite. And not only do these look great, but they also support wireless charging. So I don't even need to take off the cover to get 90 minutes of battery in just 10 minutes. And now for the shake test. We're good. So click the link down in the description below and go to buyraycon.com/KMK to get 20 to 50% off site-wide. You heard me right. You could get up to 50% off everything on Raycon's site when you go to buyraycon.com/KMK. So make sure to do that and go buy some Raycons today. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to it. So first thing, we are going to talk about the Calgary serial killer. So in the 1970s, a very strange sequence of murders occurred in Calgary, Canada. And there is a little catch to this story, but these murders were once unsolved until the evolution of DNA technology came to play and linked these crimes to a particular man, but we will talk about that after. So 4 women would be killed between the years of 1976 and 1977. Patricia McQueen, Eva Dvorak, Melissa Rahoric, and Barbara McLean. So let's talk about the first victims. The first 2 murders were actually friends and students in grades 8 and 9 who attended the Easel Bazalgette Junior High School in Calgary. And Patricia McQueen resided at 2220 37th Street Southeast in the Forest Heights area, while her friend Eva lived at 3131 30 Avenue Southeast in Dover. And they would be last seen hitchhiking. Don't hitchhike, please. At 12th Street and 9th Avenue Southeast on February 12th, 1976. And the girls were supposedly told to leave the premises after being found drinking and obviously being underage at the time. They then were seen as well out partying for the next few days, taking different drugs such as LSD, weed, and drinking alcohol as well. And a neighbor then saw them hitchhiking and they were offered a ride, which thankfully, they declined. But after this, they completely disappeared, and there was no trace of them ever being alive after this. And it wouldn't be until February 15th, about 3 days after, when their bodies were found under an overpass, unfortunately named Happy Valley. And an autopsy would reveal that they died from asphyxiation and clear signs of SA, although there were no marks on their necks to indicate asphyxiation in the way of choking. And the autopsy would also conclude that the drugs in their system were not the cause of their deaths either. And the clothes and the positions the bodies were found in suggested that the bodies were just dumped and left. And whatever happened to them did not occur in Happy Valley. And unfortunately, this is where this particular case would run cold, and no answers and no suspects would be found for decades. And the next victim of the Calgary serial killer was Melissa Rahoric, who was a 20-year-old woman originally from Windsor, Ontario, and later moved to Calgary in 1976, hoping to find more work. And she would eventually find a job as a housekeeper at a hotel and lived at the YMCA, as money was tight. And this would unfortunately lead to her death, as one of her hobbies was spending time outdoors. And since money was tight, she also decided to hitchhike. Don't hitchhike out west to enjoy some hiking in the mountains for the weekend on September 15th, 1976. And she would be last seen by her roommate at the YMCA, supposedly around 9:30 p.m. However, a Calgary transit driver reported that he may have dropped Melissa off near Highway 1 in the Bowness area. Strangely enough,
right next to Happy Valley, where the other 2 girls were found. And the next morning, September 16th, 1976, a body would be found in a ditch about 22 kilometers outside the city on a gravel road at around 10:50 a.m. near the Trans-Canada Highway. And she would be found fully clothed and had all of her possessions, including her cash. And the autopsy revealed that there had been a struggle with damage to her head specifically. There were also signs of SA, and the cause of death was also asphyxiation, just like the other 2 victims. However, found in her hand were long black hairs that weren't hers, because assuming during the struggle she probably was fighting and she pulled the hairs out of the killer's head and held on to them after she died. But with limited technology at the time, the culprit could not be identified yet. Which brings us to our 4th and final victim, Barbara McLean. So the supposed last victim of the Calgary serial killer was Barbara McLean, who was 19 years old and was employed at a bank and was originally from Nova Scotia. And 6 months later, she would be killed by this mysterious serial killer. An overly social and free-spirited soul, she would often go out with her friends to local bars. And living with her boyfriend at the time, she and her partner decided to go to Highlander Bar and meet up with some friends on February 25th, 1977. And according to witnesses, she was highly intoxicated this night and actually had a fight with her boyfriend, which eventually led to him being evicted from the bar. And she would continue without him and continue partying with her friends till about 2:30 a.m. when the bar closed. And she would then reunite with her boyfriend in their car, where the argument developed and led her to get out of the car, being left behind by her stupid boyfriend in the parking lot alone at night. And being extremely intoxicated, she had no other way to get home except for hitchhiking, because Uber and I guess taxis weren't really a thing. I don't know. I mean, I know that Uber wasn't around, but I'm assuming this area probably just didn't have a lot of taxis at the time. And her plan was to go to another party to keep the buzz going. I mean, she was 19, so I understand. I was never much of a party animal, but she would unfortunately never arrive at that next party spot. So as the next morning started, she was nowhere to be seen. However, she would then be discovered by a passerby who was walking his dog, finding her body on a Calgary road right outside the Calgary city limits. She was reported fully clothed, again with all of her belongings. However, her jacket was inside out, and she had obvious markings on her body from bruises and more. And no signs of SA were mentioned in the early reports until there was seminal fluid that was recovered at the crime scene later on. But again, no suspects were ever found until decades later. As technology would evolve, they would finally develop and reopen the case to catch the Calgary serial killer. And multiple more disappearances and murders would happen over the years in Calgary. However, it wasn't until very recently that some of these would actually be solved and be linked to a man named Gary Allen Srieri. So let's talk about this piece of shit and how technically this case wasn't officially solved. So Gary Allen Srieri, if I'm saying your name wrong, I don't give a because you're a piece of shit, was a man with a criminal record, let's just say that. He was born in 1942 in Oak Park, Illinois, and he truly was a criminal at heart, with theft, and evolved into charged convict after being arrested in Los Angeles for brutal SA grape, sodomy, and kidnapping. Just like, he really ticked him off really quick, just all the bad things, except for murder, yet. And he would then serve his time in San Quentin prison and was released. But the crimes obviously did not stop there. In 1974, for example, he was posted for bail for yet another grape charge in California, escaping the United States to avoid responsibility. Look at this piece of shit. He looks like he just looks like it. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? He's got one of those faces just... I tell you what. And his time in Canada was chock full of more crimes, illegally coming into the country and living under multiple aliases to hide from the law. And these names ranged from Willie Long, Rex Long, and William Rex Long. I guess this guy really liked T-Rexes or something. I don't really know. I don't know. Maybe he's got like really short arms or something. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. Just... But he would then spend most of his time working menial jobs under these aliases, usually for like under the table cash, as to not have his name or names linked to anything. And he would spend most of his time in Alberta and British Columbia, shout out to British Columbia, between 1976 and 2003. And he would change his vehicles and disguises frequently so as to not raise suspicion. So between 1976 and 1977, when the 4 murders took place, he was frequently evading the law thanks to the lack of technology for forensics, and also changing
changing disguises, and more, like we talked about. He would also continually move around constantly as to evade the law, making it extremely hard for the police to nail him down. And there are questions from authorities if he truly was the one responsible for the 4, but it's unclear. The force never truly closed the cases, reopening them frequently and exchanging notes between precincts. And in the 1990s, they would reopen the cases to investigate the DNA traces left behind at the scenes of the crime. And in 2003, they created a DNA profile for this unknown man to hopefully find more evidence in the future. And what they were able to find was a link between Melissa and Barbara, and it would be found that they were murdered by the same person. And thankfully, the case would finally actually be solved due to the evolution of the DNA technology, and the case would be reopened in 2023. And these connections finally linked to the culprit, Gary Allen Sweary, who was completely off the radar for the initial investigation. But thanks to the help of the US, the cross-reference databases had matched. However, and this is where he wasn't technically caught, died. The mother died before he could have got caught. And he died in 2011. So it was like 12 years after when he got caught. So just bullshit. And it is very unsure if those were the only crimes or murders that he committed in Canada. I'm going to safely assume he's murdered a lot more people, because his history just speaks for itself. And there's no doubt, as more investigations are reopened, the families of the victims can finally be given closure, knowing that the deaths of their families had been solved. At least we have that. At least we have closure for the families. But Gary is truly looking up at us from down below. Just flaming, just boiling and burning and broiling in hell. And this is the victims' families' responses to the solved murders. Quote unquote, saying, "We would like to thank from the bottom of our hearts the team of individuals who worked so many days and countless hours on solving this cold case. Without them, we would still not know today what happened to our sister Patsy, Patricia, and her friend Eva. We will forever be grateful and thankful that they never gave up on our girls," said the McQueen family in a statement. And the DeVork's family said that they are thankful for the closure they have been given as well, saying, quote unquote, "Eva was loved and cherished by her family and all who knew her. Her bright smile and bubbly personality was contagious and lit up any room. When Eva was around, there was no sitting still, always dancing and singing any time of the day. She enjoyed spending time with her sisters and cousins while swimming, roller skating, and ice skating." And from Melissa's family, "Our message is one about Melissa, being a fun, loving, adventurous, and hardworking person. She was honest, positive person who trusted people. She enjoyed traveling to Banff," I love Banff, "for her love of nature, but also to travel for her curiosity about seeing Canada." And the McLeans also expressed appreciation finally having the answers to questions that we've had to live with all these years. So I think that's like the most important part, is that these families got closure. But there are a lot of other families who had people that went missing and murdered that are still unsolved and might be linked to Gary, piece of shit Gary. So hopefully they're able to figure those out. But that is all we have for the first case, and we move on to the second uncaught killer. And this is actually like plural uncaught killers. There could be a span of serial killers for this case, and that is the Highway of Tears. And for those of you who don't know, the Highway of Tears refers to a remote and infamous stretch of Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada, where numerous Indigenous women and girls, along with some non-Indigenous women, but mostly Indigenous women, have gone missing or been found murdered over several decades. Stretching over 720 kilometers, or for my Americans, about 450 miles from Prince George to Prince Rupert, this highway has been the site of tragedies that have left many families shattered and questions unanswered. And the ongoing mysteries surrounding these cases has not only exposed systemic issues within the investigation processes, but also highlighted the vulnerability of Indigenous women in Canadian society. Because between 1969 and 2011, over 40 women, most of which are Indigenous women, have gone missing or have been murdered near or alongside the highway. And Indigenous women in Canada specifically face disproportionately high rates of violence and systemic neglect from law enforcement and government institutions. And the cases on Highway 16 have gained international attention, underscoring the need for structural changes to address not just these specific cases, but also
the broader national crisis. So let's get into some of the victims and some of the suspects. And I quite literally cannot talk about every single victim because there are so many. There are so many more than 40. So I will just talk about some of the better known cases because a lot of them, like I said, are just kind of like brushed under the rug. So I will highlight some of the ones that are more known, and then we'll get into who some of the suspects are and what some of the theories are. So we're going to start off with Gloria Moody. Gloria Moody was aged 26, and she was a mother of 2 from Bella Coola First Nation. And on October 25th, 1969, Gloria was last seen leaving a bar in Williams Lake. She had been out spending an evening just socializing with friends and partying, as you do, because there's not a lot else to do up there, I'm going to be honest. But unfortunately, her body would be discovered the next day in a remote cattle field outside of the town, approximately 10 kilometers from where she was last seen. And the autopsy would show that Gloria had been beaten to death. The cause of death was determined by blunt force trauma and exposure to the elements. And despite an investigation, no suspects have been publicly identified. And her murder remains unsolved, not unlike all the other victims I'm going to talk about. And next is Monica Ignis. 15-year-old Monica Ignis was a young student attending school in Thornhill, British Columbia. And on December 13th, 1974, Monica would be walking home from her school, Thornhill, near Terrace, when she disappeared. And 6 days after her disappearance, her body would be found in a forested area off Highway 16 near Terrace. And Monica had been strangled to death. And no suspects had been publicly named, and her case remains unsolved. Next, we have Maureen Mosey. 33-year-old Maureen Mosey was a non-Indigenous woman living in Alberta, and she was known to hitchhike regularly across British Columbia and Alberta. Don't hitchhike. And Maureen would be last seen hitchhiking near Salmon Arm in British Columbia on May 8th, 1981. And her body would be found the next day along the stretch of Highway 97 near Kamloops, British Columbia, about 150 kilometers south of the Highway of Tears region. And Maureen had also been beaten to death. And despite this case being widely publicized, it remains unsolved with no suspects. And next we have Alberta Williams, who was a 24-year-old Indigenous woman from Gitxsan First Nation in northern British Columbia. And she lived in Prince Rupert, a city near the western end of the Highway of Tears, like we talked about. And on August 26, 1989, Alberta would be last seen leaving a pub in Prince Rupert with her friends and her sister. Alberta and the group of friends had been celebrating the end of the salmon fishing season, but later that night, she would disappear, and her body would be found on September 25th, 1989, in a rural area along the Highway 16 near the Skeena River. And Alberta had been SA'd and strangled to death. And despite extensive investigation at this time, no charges were ever laid. But in 2016, the CBC podcast Missing and Murdered: Who Killed Alberta Williams renewed interest in the case, but it now still remains unsolved. Next, we have Ramona Wilson. 16-year-old Ramona Wilson was a high school student from the Gitxsan Nation, living in Smithers, British Columbia. And on June 11th, 1994, Ramona was last seen hitchhiking to attend a dance in Hazelton, a small community near Smithers. But unfortunately, she would never arrive to her destination. And Ramona's remains would be found nearly a year later, in April 1995, near the Smithers Airport, not far from Highway 16. And due to the condition of her remains, the cause of death was never actually determined, but investigators suspected foul play. Several items, including rope and other objects, were found near her body, indicating she may have been bound or restrained in some way. Next, we have Ayla Sarek Auger. Ayla was an Indigenous teenager from the Ladli Tene First Nation in Prince George, British Columbia. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And she would be last seen on February 2nd, 2006 in Prince George. And she would be last seen walking along Highway 16 when she vanished. And her body would be discovered 1 week later in a ditch along Highway 16, about 15 kilometers outside of Prince George. So she was clearly like picked up or something and then murdered. And the specific cause of her death was not publicly released, but it is known that she was murdered. And her case remains unsolved. And the last victim we're going to talk about, because there's dozens and dozens more, is Tamara Chipman. Tamara Chipman was also an Indigenous woman from the Metlakatla First Nation living in Prince Rupert. And Tamara would be last seen hitchhiking near an intersection along Highway 16 on a road leading to a Prince Rupert industrial site on September 21st, 2005. And she was attempting to hitch a ride home to Terrace. But despite extensive searches, Tamara's body was actually never found. And her family continues to advocate for answers. And her case remains one of the most high-profile unsolved disappearances along the Highway Highway of Tears. And obviously, since Tamara's body had never been found, her case still remains unresolved. So while some of the cases share similarities, such as the women disappearing while hitchhiking, the diversity of the methods of killing, such as strangulation, blunt force trauma, and SA, complicates efforts to link the cases to a single perpetrator, which I think it's impossible that this is a single perpetrator, quite literally. And many experts believe that many different killers may have been operating along the Highway of Tears during these years and over the decades, taking advantage of the isolation of the area and the lack of resources for comprehensive investigations. Essentially, it was just a perfect breeding ground for serial killers. So let's go over the leads and suspects. So several very well-known serial killers have been considered suspects in a lot of these unsolved murders along the Highway of Tears. Given the vast span along this geographical isolated area, investigators have entertained the possibility that multiple serial offenders have preyed on the vulnerable women hitchhiking along this remote highway. So first, we'll start with Bobby Jack Fowler. Bobby Jack Fowler was an American drifter with a long criminal history, including SA, attempted murder, and kidnapping. Just ticking all those boxes. He spent a lot of time working as a laborer in Canada and the US in the 1970s and 80s, a period of time when a lot of the murders occurred on the Highway of Tears. And Fowler was definitively linked to a murder that happened in 1974, which was the murder of a 16-year-old girl named KallMeKris, one of the youngest victims along the Highway of Tears. And in 2012, advances in DNA technology led to that match between Fowler's DNA and the evidence from Colleen's murder. She would also disappear while hitchhiking, and her body would be found shortly after. But Fowler would die in prison in 2006. But investigators do believe that he was responsible, most likely, for additional murders along the Highway of Tears, and potentially in other parts of the US and Canada. But again, we'll probably never know because he's dead. F you. Burn in hell. Next, we have Cody Legbokov. I don't care, because you're stupid and a piece of shit and you're awful. I don't care how you say your name. Anyway, Cody is a convicted Canadian serial killer and responsible for the murders of 4 women, including a teenage girl, between 2009 and 2010. Cody was only 19 years old when he began his killing spree. His victims, including a 15-year-old Lauren Lisley, were all from British Columbia, though not all of them were Indigenous or connected to the Highway of Tears directly. And where Cody's crimes do not precisely fit the pattern of the earlier Highway of Tears murders, his proximity to the region and the nature of his crimes, targeting women in rural areas, have raised suspicion that he could be linked to other unresolved cases. However, there is no conclusive evidence linking him to any of the Highway of Tears victims, technically. And his relative youth at the time of his conviction makes him less likely to have been involved in those earlier cases. But investigators have not completely ruled him out as a suspect for recent disappearances. And that brings us to Edward Dennis Isaac. Edward Dennis Isaac is a lesser-known suspect in the Highway of Tears murders. He was convicted of the brutal rape and murder of a 49-year-old Indigenous woman, Margaret Peggy Nicole, in Prince George in 1981. And Isaac had a history of violence and was known to frequent the Highway 16, the Highway of Tears. And while Isaac was only convicted of 1 murder, his proximity to the Highway of Tears and his violent tendencies had led some to speculate that he may be responsible for some of the unresolved murders. However, no direct evidence links him to the Highway of Tears cases beyond his violent history. But you could probably safely assume that wasn't his first victim, based off of his history. Which brings us to a very, I think, likely suspect, the Green River Killer, otherwise known as Gary Ridgway. And he is one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Let me know down below if you actually want me to do a deep dive on Gary Ridgway, because my God, it's something. But anyway, he's responsible for the murders of at least 49 women in Washington state during the 1980s to the 1990s. And most of his victims were vulnerable women, many of whom were ladies of the night or runaways. Ridgway's killings primarily took place in Washington, but the geographic proximity of his hunting grounds to British Columbia has led to the speculation that he could have gone across the border to continue hunting, because the Pacific Northwest region of British Columbia has been a hotbed for serial killers, and the Green River Killer's MO, targeting women along highways, fits the pattern of the Highway of Tears murders. However, again, there was no concrete evidence linking Ridgway to any Canadian murders, and he has never been formally named a suspect in the Highway of Tears cases. And next we have Keith Hunter Jesperson, otherwise known as the Happy Face Killer. Also, let me know if you wanted me to do a deep dive on him, because he is
something else too. But Keith, otherwise known as a happy face killer, murdered at least 8 women in the United States during the 1990s. And Jesperson, a long-haul trucker, traveled extensively across North America, leaving a trail of victims in multiple states. And he earned his nickname by drawing happy faces on letters he sent to the media, taunting authorities about his crimes, aka a piece of shit. Jesperson's occupation as a long-haul trucker gave him the mobility to commit murders across vast distances, aka possibly the Highway of Tears. And he would admit murdering multiple victims over those span of years that the Highway of Tears victims started to pile up. However, no direct evidence has ever connected him to any specific case in the region. But I feel like it's also fair to assume. And last but not least, we have the infamous Robert Pickton, which if you don't know who that is, you could check out this video for a deep dive, but my god, he's a piece of shit, and my god, he's dead. He died. He died like months after I did that deep dive on him. I feel like it's probably for the best. But anyway, Robert Pickton is one of Canada's most infamous serial killers. I'd say the most infamous serial killer. But he was only convicted of murdering 6 women, but suspected of killing many more, possibly up to 49. And Robert Pickton said that he wished he could have got to 50. So it's like almost a guaranteed 49. I hate him so much. He lived 20 minutes away from me. Anyway, Pickton also preyed on vulnerable women, mostly those that were ladies of the night as well in Vancouver's downtown east side. And he would lure them back to his pig farm in Port Coquitlam, where they were murdered and their remains were disposed of in his pig farm, basically. But although his crimes did mostly take place in Vancouver, the proximity to Highway 16 and the nature of his victims, often marginalized women, has led some to speculate that he could be one of the people that murdered women on the Highway of Tears. However, again, no evidence has been directly linked to Pickton. And given his geographical focus, more so in the Vancouver area, it's probably more unlikely. I'd say this is probably the most unlikely instance, but he's still a piece of shit and he's dead. So, but the idea of multiple serial killers operating along the Highway of Tears is like the most horrifying thing ever. And while some serial killers like Bobby Jack Fowler have been definitively linked to a victim along the highway, others just remain speculative suspects due to the lack of conclusive evidence. So it is likely that the combination of factors, including serial offenders, local predators, and possibly just opportunistic killings by individuals passing through the region, contributed to the ongoing tragedy of the Highway of Tears. And despite the ongoing investigation and public interest, many of these cases remain unsolved, leaving open the possibility that some of these notorious killers may still be linked to some of these unresolved murders in the area. And I think these women need justice. So I think shedding some light on the case might help in some way, but I really think these families need closure. And it's in my home, you know? So yeah, that is our second uncaught killer, and that brings us to our last. And this last murder is probably the strangest murder yet. To preface, despite the murder taking place in 2010, it remains unsolved. Furthermore, if you look up the murders, there is barely any information available. And many of the links that claim to have information about the cases often result in 505 errors. This indicates that there are issues on the server sides and could potentially point to some sort of covering up. And this is the case of the Tuma family murders. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I've looked everywhere to how to pronounce this, and for some reason I cannot find it, so I'm praying that that's how you say it. On August 6th, 2010, in Regina, Canada, residents of a local townhome began to complain of a horrible smell coming from one of the neighbors' residences. And as soon as the property manager was notified, they went over to check on the small family that resided there. And upon opening the door and walking in, they were horrified to see the family of 3 brutally murdered and rotting in their townhome. And the details of the crime scene have never been released or revealed. But it is said that the actual crime scene was so atrocious that the body's decomposition process was expedited due to the nature of their injuries. But the one definite piece of information that we do have about the crime scene is that a gun was not used in the murders. And the 3 victims were Gray Natu, aged 31, his wife Mama, aged 28, and their 3-year-old son, 7 June 2. And it is believed that the family had been deceased for at least 1 day before being discovered by the property manager. And as soon as the bodies were discovered, a massive search began with at least 25 Regina officers working at one time. And during the investigation, it was found that the family were Burmese refugees who came to Canada from a refugee camp in Myanmar. And they came to Canada in hopes to find a better life. And the neighbors within the complex were interviewed, and they claimed that the family was extremely quiet and the wife and child hardly ever left the
the complex, unless the father was home. And Gray worked at a recycling plant, and Mama was a stay-at-home mom. And neighbors had also commented on how Gray was seemingly a very paranoid man. When he would leave from his home to go to work, he was seen checking outside his front door multiple times, ensuring that it was locked before he left. And it was said that suspicious-looking people went in and out of the home on a regular basis. But the priest of the church that the family attended claimed that the family was very happy to be in Canada, but that they were struggling to make ends meet with just the father working. And this could explain the sketchy people leaving and entering the house, because the family could have been engaging in some sort of illegal activities for extra cash. And maybe that was why they were so brutally murdered, because of a drug deal or something else that went wrong. And the only real piece of evidence that we have of the night of the family getting murdered comes from one of the neighbors named Mandy, who claimed to hear what sounded like fireworks coming from the two residents. More specifically, she said, quote unquote, "I know what fireworks sound like, and it wasn't fireworks. It was very loud. It was close. Very close." What the was it, Mandy? But it stated explicitly that a gun was not involved in the murder of the two families. So what was Mandy hearing through the walls of her townhome? Furthermore, she heard loud pops through the wall, but not screaming. And it seems a little suspicious, because if the murder was so gruesome as investigators stated it was, then someone probably should have been heard screaming at least once. And if there was no screaming, then it was possible that maybe the murderer wasn't alone, and maybe it was a group big enough for members to bind and maybe gag the family. And during the investigation, the investigators interviewed quite literally hundreds of people from the Burmese and Karen. Not just a Karen, but the Karen people are an ancient ethnic population from Burma. And it was hard to gain any information at first because of the language barrier, but an interpreter was brought in. And still, the investigators learned nothing. And according to the local Karen population, they believed that the police had the wrong suspects, and that nobody in the Karen community would have committed such heinous acts against one of their own people. Even more strange is the fact that people from the interceptor responsible for interviewing the Karen community went home early and left many people's testimonies off the official record simply because they were not interviewed. In an article, it says, an RCMP officer who speaks Karen was brought in to help during the early stages of the police investigation. It was expected he would be able to help build bridges and gain information on the murder from some of the estimated 600 Karen people currently living in the city. He returned home to British Columbia at the end of January. Quite a few Karen people were unhappy with the officer cooperation with the police, especially when it came to dealing with the people of interest that the police were investigating, according to Wyatt. So no suspects were ever found or listed, and the family of three never got their justice. So the cold case of the Tuma family remains unsolved to this day. And the city of Regina has put out a $50,000 reward for anyone who can provide any new evidence or information about the case. But no one has come forward yet. But it seems that this case remains cold because of poor handling by the Regina police, along with the language barrier and the unknown circumstances surrounding the family. So hopefully someday the murder can be brought to justice, but until then, we won't know. So that concludes the video. I hope I was able to shed some light on some really interesting cases for you guys. And if you have any suggestions for any other true crime deep dives or any other kinds of deep dives, let me know down in the comments below. But yeah, stay safe out there, and I'm gonna go to bed. Bye. On August 31st, 2016, two people got in a car and drove to work, but they never came home. No goodbye, no warning, and no trace. Just two people here one moment and gone the next, leaving behind nothing but questions and a little dog with no food and no water. This is the terrifying disappearance of Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Now today we are talking about a very mysterious case, so without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 to the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through the windshield into this mysterious case together. You know that email from your dentist that says, "You're due for a cleaning"? Well, I've archived that same email for about 14 months, and I just have like a whole graveyard of healthcare emails I keep meaning to get to. You know, the weird mole on my back, am keeping an eye on. And at some point, the I'll deal with it later just started to become my personality trait. So this past year, I actually did the thing and I booked doctor's appointments with ZocDoc. And for those of you who don't know, ZocDoc is a free app and website that helps you find and book high-quality in-network doctors so you can find someone that you actually love. We're talking 150,000 providers in all 50 states with 200 plus specialties like dermatology, dental, primary care, you name it. And you could read thousands of verified patient reviews too and see real-time availability and click to book instantly. So you're not playing phone tag back and forth with the doctor's office, which is so annoying. And most appointments happen within 24 hours to 72 hours, and you can even get some same-day appointments. I know I have on several occasions. But I use ZocDoc, and I highly recommend that you do as well. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/CCCM to find and instantly book a doctor you love today. That's ZocDoc.com/CCCM. ZocDoc.com/CCCM. Thank you so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring the video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. Kayla Victoria Brown was born on November 17, 1985 in Anderson, South Carolina, a small city tucked into the northwest corner of the state, close enough to the Georgia line that people sometimes forget which Carolina they're in. And there were no headlines from her childhood, no stories that made the news. The world wasn't paying attention to Kayla Brown. Not yet. But her mother, Bobby Newsom, raised her there, and by her late 20s, Anderson was still home. And at 30 years old, Kayla stood 5'8" with reddish-brown hair and green eyes. And people who knew her described her as someone warm and someone very present. Now, Dan Herron knew the family well, and he dated Kayla's mother years earlier and stayed close to both of them. And he called Kayla a very close friend of mine. Now, she had a Pomeranian named Romeo, and that dog went everywhere with her. And if you asked anyone close to Kayla who mattered most in her life, it was Romeo, her dog. And her mother, Bobby, put it simply, saying, quote, "That dog is her baby," unquote. I can relate. I have 5 babies, and they're all dogs. But to make some extra money, Kayla picked up cleaning jobs on the side. And she'd been acquainted with a local real estate broker named Todd Kolep for years, connected through Facebook after she posted looking for extra work. Now, Kolep hired her a handful of times to clean houses tied to his listings. And she usually brought her boyfriend along with her to help. But the work was straightforward and the pay was decent. Overall, a pretty good gig. Now, Charles David Carver was born on November 19th, 1983 in Anderson, South Carolina, the same town as Kayla, 2 years and 2 days apart. And most people called him Charlie. And he was 5'11" with brown hair and blue eyes and about 180 pounds. And before settling into civilian life, he'd done time in the Army National Guard. And he'd also been an explorer cadet with the Anderson County Sheriff's Office. And by his early 30s, he'd settled into civilian work as a printing machine operator at a company called First Quality Tissue. But the job was just how he paid bills. And what Charlie loved was everything else. The man loved pool, he played in both 9-ball and 8-ball leagues around town, and he was a writer, and he was working on his 5th mystery novel. And his father, Chuck Carver, said about Charles, quote, "He never hurt anybody. He would give you the shirt off his back or the last $2 in his pocket. That was just the guy he was," unquote. And his mother, Joanne, saw it the same way, saying, quote, "He could bring a smile to the saddest person. He loved to laugh. He loved making people laugh," unquote. Now, Mackenzie Durham had known Charlie since high school, and even after the romance ended, the friendship held for 16 years. That was just the kind of person he was, the kind that people just held on to. So Kayla and Charlie started dating sometime in the spring of 2016. And by August, they were sharing an apartment in Anderson. And at this point, it had only been a few months. It happened fast, the way things sometimes do when two people just fit. And Charlie's situation wasn't uncomplicated, though, because his divorce from his wife, Nikki, hadn't been finalized yet. But on paper, he was still a married man. And Dan Herron saw it coming and didn't hold back, saying, quote, "I warned her. I said, Kayla, you're dealing with a married couple here," unquote. But Kayla and Charlie pushed forward anyway, and their friends could see this wasn't a fling. Marriage was already part of the conversation. situation. And they'd only been a couple for around 4 or 5 months at this point, but both of them were very serious about it, and they were happy together. But they were also broke. Making ends meet was a constant struggle, so any chance they had to pick up extra work, they took. So on August 29th, 2016, a friend came by the apartment that evening, and the three of them sat down for dinner together. Just a normal night. And on August 30th, Kayla was still texting people back, and several friends heard from her that day, nothing unusual. But then came August 31st. That morning, Charlie clocked out of his shift at work, and he was caught on the building's surveillance feed heading out the door. But this would be the last time anyone saw him on camera. And after that, both of their phones went quiet, and the texts stopped, and so did the calls. Everything stopped. Now, Kayla and Charlie's day was pretty simple. Todd Kohlep, the real estate broker Kayla had cleaned houses for over years, had asked them to come out to a piece of property he owned near Woodruff, South Carolina. And their job was to clear brush. Now, Kayla did consider asking a different person to come, but she ended up just getting her boyfriend to come along with her, as he usually did on a lot of her jobs. So the two of them drove out together to a property that stretched across nearly 100 acres of woods and open land in rural Spartanburg County. The communities surrounding the property were places where people recognized each other at the grocery store and the football field. And Greenville news reporter Michael Burns described them as, quote, typical small southern towns, home to high school football and Sunday dinners after church, unquote. So Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver would do what they were supposed to do and go to their job. But this would be the day they would mysteriously go missing. Now, Joanne Shiflett, Charlie's mother, had a rule with her son. A day didn't pass where the two of them didn't talk in some way. A text, a call, something. Days of silence turned into a week, and Joanne picked up the phone and called the front office at the apartment complex where the couple lived. And she asked someone to go knock on their door. So the manager knocked, but no answer. And so she let herself in, and everything inside was untouched, and the place felt abandoned. But she did find one thing, and that was Romeo, Kayla's Pomeranian, and left behind with no food and no water. And Charlie's mother reported him missing on September 3rd. And 2 days later, a friend of Kayla's went to the police and filed her own missing persons report. And both cases would go through Anderson PD. And what investigators found inside the apartment only deepened the family's panic, because Kayla's glasses were still there, and her contact lenses were too, and also the medication she took regularly, and her car sat untouched in the parking lot. And the only thing unaccounted for was Charlie's car, a white 2002 Pontiac Grand Prix with the plate number HWY224. And the woman who managed Anderson Crossing told reporters Charlie had rented there going on 3 years. And when his rent was unpaid, she said that was a red flag. He never missed a payment. Charlie just didn't do that. So both families were certain of one thing. Kayla and Charlie hadn't left on their own. And the proof to them was the dog. Kayla wouldn't walk away from Romeo. That was not a possibility anyone who knew her would believe. But days would turn into weeks, and no one knew what to do. So the two mothers, Bobby and Joanne, went to the apartment together that weekend, and they would just box up every last thing their kids owned, and they would just move it into storage, waiting for a return that might not come. And Joanne tried to explain the weight of it to Dateline, saying, quote, "It's so much worse than you can think, not knowing. It's like you have a hot skillet and there are 2 drops of water you put on it, and they just disappear," unquote. And the community stepped in where the investigation stalled, and volunteers printed flyers and papered them across Anderson. And Facebook groups sprang up overnight, sharing the couple's photos, pushing the story further than local news could ever carry it. And Dateline picked up the case on October 10th, running the couple's story over a month later as part of the Missing in America series. But as the weeks dragged on, something strange started happening on Charlie's Facebook page. Posts kept appearing, more than 50 of them after the couple vanished, in fact. One entry slotted into July said Kayla was pregnant with a baby girl. And another in August said they closed on a home. Third, dated September 1st, announced a wedding. And photos were uploaded too, presented as if they were recent. And the family recognized them immediately. They'd been posted more than a year earlier. Joanne knew her son's voice. Whoever was writing those posts wasn't Charlie. At least that's what she thought. And then the content would start to turn dark, and the account started filling up with disturbing memes and violent imagery. One read, quote, "I weren't crazy, I'd be insane," unquote. And another said, quote, "Sometimes late at night, I dig a hole in the backyard to keep the nosy neighbors guessing," unquote. The family was adamant Charlie's account had been hijacked, but the damage was already done, and the stream posts gave some people a reason to believe the couple had simply walked away from their lives. It kind of muddied the urgency, and it created doubt where there should have been alarm, and it bought the person responsible for their disappearance exactly what he needed: time. And while someone was using Charlie's account to muddy the search, Todd Kohlmeck was posting on his own page, the guy who hired Kayla and Charlie multiple times. 2 weeks after the couple vanished, he wrote a post actually mocking missing persons cases, saying, quote, "People go missing all the time. They always turn up somewhere," unquote. And then he added a line about himself, saying, quote, "In the event I become missing, please note no one would take me. I eat too much and I am crabby," unquote. So who really was Todd Kohlmeck? Todd Christopher Samsell was born on March 7th, 1971 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And he was an only child, and his parents, Regina and William Samsell, split up when he was just 2 years old. And Regina won the custody battle, and a year later she married again. And by 1976, the new husband had legally adopted Todd. And that's how he became Todd Kohlmeck. The home he grew up in was anything but stable, though. And he and his stepfather clashed constantly, because his mother and stepfather divorced, then reconciled, and then would divorce again. And therapists who evaluated him over the years saw the same thing every time. Todd resented his stepfather, and the father he actually wanted to be with was his biological dad, but that was someone he hadn't seen in 8 years. But the warning signs showed up early. As far back as nursery school, teachers watched him go after other children and break their things. And by age 9, he was in counseling, and the clinical language in his file was pretty blunt. It was just explosive. And for a 9-year-old, a disturbing fixation, which was, quote, "preoccupied with sexual content," unquote. And he also hurt animals, and he shot a neighbor's dog with a BB gun, and he killed a goldfish by pouring Clorox bleach into the bowl. And years later, his birth father tried to describe his son's emotional rage, and all he could come up with was anger and madness, and that was it. And those were the only 2 settings. Just a rageful, mean little 9-year-old asshole, essentially. So at 9 years old, Todd was admitted to the Georgia Mental Health Institute as an inpatient. And he stayed for 3.5 months, and he couldn't get along with the other children. And while there, the therapist documented 2 things. Todd still openly hated his stepfather, and his fixation on sexual content persisted. And the marriage between his mother and stepfather collapsed again in 1982. And that summer, Todd was sent to stay with William Samsell, his biological father. And it was the first real time they really had together. But the visit would end, and Todd returned home to his mother. And that's when he would take a hammer to his own bedroom and just tear it apart. And then he told his mother he'd kill her if she didn't let him go back to his father's. And that October, the Spartanburg School District flagged the 12-year-old now for an evaluation, because teachers just could not control this kid, because he would blow up at the smallest provocation, defy authority on reflex, and shut down completely if anyone corrected him. The evaluation stretched from December 1982 through May 1983. And once the evaluation wrapped up, Regina agreed to let Todd go. And he packed up and moved to Arizona, where his father was waiting. And a neighbor described the boy as a devil on a chain. And Todd forced her son into a dog kennel, sealed it shut, and sent it rolling across the yard. And then he grabbed the kid and cracked his head against clay pipes. And while her son cried, Todd just laughed. He thought it was hilarious. And once settled in Arizona, Todd dropped the Kohlep name temporarily and went by Samsel again. And he started working whatever odd jobs he could find nearby. And his father actually collected weapons and taught the boy how to handle them. That is not good parenting for a child that is literally diagnosed as crazy and angry and rageful. But what do I know? I'm not a parent, you know? And he would also show Todd how to blow things up and make bombs. I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, essentially, is what we're seeing right now. A little nature, a little nurture, working 50-50 in this one. But this father-son relationship would fall apart too, because William was constantly gone, spending his time with a string of girlfriends. And Todd asked to go back to his mother, but Regina didn't want him back. Not surprising. And every time Todd asked to come home, she found another reason to delay. So neither parent, it seemed, wanted to be the one holding the devil on the chain. And on November 25th, 1986, 15-year-old Todd kidnapped a 14-year-old girl named Christy Granado in Tempe, Arizona. And he forced her at gunpoint with a .22 caliber revolver. And he marched her back to the house where he was living, restrained her, covered her mouth with tape, and asked her. And afterward, he walked her home and he told her if she said a word, he'd kill her entire family. Oh my God. But luckily, she would tell them anyway, and Kohlep was charged with kidnapping and assault and committing a dangerous crime against children. And a guilty plea on the kidnapping count came in 1987, and the charge and the charge for crimes against children were dismissed as part of the deal, and the sentence was 15 years in prison. And court records from the case painted a clinical picture, and he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and his IQ tested at 118, which is above average. And the sentencing judge saw exactly what he was dealing with. On paper, the kid had potential, quote, very bright and should be advanced academically, unquote. But that package came with something the court just couldn't fix, quote, behaviorally and emotionally dangerous, unquote. So rehabilitation, the judge concluded, was unlikely. And as probation officer noted in the court file, Kohlep, quote, felt the world owed him something, unquote. And in prison, the early years looked like a continuation of everything before, and he racked up violations, and some of them were violent. But after he turned 20, something shifted, and there were no more incidents on his record. And whether that meant he'd changed or simply just learned how to hide was a question no one seemed to ask. So while locked up, Kohlep earned a degree in computer science from Central Arizona College. And in August of 2001, after 14 years behind bars, he would walk out. And he was now 30 years old. And he moved to South Carolina to live with his mother. And on November 30th, 2001, he registered as a sex offender. And for the next few years, he bounced between jobs and classrooms. And he worked graphic design at a Spartanburg company for almost 2 years, and he enrolled at Greenville Technical College. And then in 2006, he applied for a South Carolina real estate license. And the application asked about prior felony convictions, and Kohlep naturally lied on that question, and the license was granted. Not doing criminal background checks in 2006 or what's going on there. Anyway, and by 2008, he had a bachelor's degree from the University of South Carolina Upstate in business administration and marketing. And by then, he was already building his empire. And his real estate brokerage grew fast. At its peak, 12 agents worked under him, and other agents knew his name. And he ranked among the top sellers in the Carolinas. And on top of all that, he got certified to fly planes and started buying real estate in other states. And the people around him saw a driven, confident professional. And Cherry Lawrence, who worked for him, said, quote, he was an excellent boss. He stood up for us whenever we needed him, unquote. And everyone in the office knew about the registry. That actually wasn't a secret, but Kohlep had a story for that. Of course he had a backup story for that. But he told people the whole thing was overblown. He'd gone joyriding with a girl, and her father blew it out of proportion. And his neighbor, Ron Owens, saw nothing alarming either. Quote, Todd was, in my opinion, a likable guy, unquote. But cracks showed if you knew where to look. And a woman who'd done a real estate deal with him said the charm was real at first. But the longer you talked to KallMeKris, the more he drifted. Guns kept coming up, and his comments took on a sexual edge that made people uncomfortable. He was a regular at a Waffle House in Roebuck, and the women on staff dreaded seeing him walk in. And eventually, the cook, a man, took over serving him because none of the waitresses wanted to go near his table. And one of those waitresses was a young woman named Megan Lee McCraw Coxey. Now, on November 6th, 2003, a customer walked into Superbike Motorsports, a motorcycle dealership in Chesney, South Carolina, and he found 4 people shot. 2 inside the shop and 2 outside. They were dead. And one of those people was Scott Ponder, who was 30, who owned the shop, and the other was his mother, Beverly Guy, 52 years old, the bookkeeper, and then there was Brian Lucas, who was 29 years old and was the service manager. And lastly, there was Chris Sherbert, who was 26-year-old and was a mechanic. And Scott's wife, Melissa, didn't see him leave that morning. She was still in bed, and she was 7 weeks pregnant. And she never saw him alive again. But all 4 died from multiple gunshot wounds, and investigators pieced together a theory of what happened. Sherbert was the first to die, shot while working in the back of the building, and Beverly Guy was next, killed on the showroom floor, and Brian Lucas went down near the front door, and Scott Ponder was gunned down outside in the parking lot. Detectives collected 18 9mm shell casings from the scene, a mix of brass and nickel-plated rounds, and 2 different types of ammunition, which complicated the ballistic analysis from the start. And the case consumed the small community of Chesney, and rumors would spread fast. And some people blamed a Mexican drug gang, and others whispered about a love triangle. The speculation crushed the victims' families, and as the years dragged on, detectives ran ballistics on every weapon they thought might be connected, and 27 guns in total. And not one of them matched the casings from the scene, though. And at one point, the shell casings crossed the Atlantic, and a lab in England had advanced fingerprint technology that didn't exist in the US at the time, and even that came back empty. Nothing worked. And Sheriff Chuck Wright later explained why KallMeKris had never been on their radar, saying, quote, "There was no reason to interview everybody. There was nothing in the gentleman's background that screamed, 'I did this,'" unquote. So the case went cold, and it stayed that way for 13 years. And when the truth finally came out, the motive would be almost impossible to believe, because he wanted to learn how to ride a motorcycle, and they laughed at him when he fell over on the bike. So 4 people dead because someone felt humiliated. And while the Superbike investigation stalled, KallMeKris was quietly building something else. The property he bought in May 2014 sat about 9 miles outside Moore, South Carolina, nearly 100 acres of rural land, and the price tag was $305,632. And then he spent another $80,000 on a chain-link fence around the entire perimeter, and motion-activated deer cameras went up in the tree line to monitor anyone approaching, and bear traps were scattered across the grounds as well. And his neighbor, Scott Waldrop, had lived next door for over 2 decades. And to Waldrop, the guy next door was just another survivalist type, someone who wanted to be left alone and took it more seriously than most. Nothing threatening about that. Quote, "He didn't seem like a threat," unquote. And he would assume he was a survivalist because KallMeKris had a shipping container he purchased on his property, actually that his girlfriend purchased for him, Holly Udy. So Holly would put up the money for the shipping container in 2014, and as far as she knew, it was just for storing supplies like food, ammo, standard prepper gear. And as a convicted felon, KallMeKris couldn't legally buy firearms, so he used a man named Dustin Lawson to do it for him. And over a 4-year stretch from 2012 to 2016, Lawson made purchase after purchase on KallMeKris's behalf. 12 firearms, 5 silencers, and every time he filled out the federal paperwork claiming he he was the buyer, and every single form was a lie. And the weapons were spread across the property, some hidden in drawers, others sitting out in the open on shelving, and some mounted underneath a workbench where you'd never spot them unless you were looking. And a gun safe, a stockpile of ammunition, so the property wasn't a farm, it was a retreat. It was a trap. So on August 31st, 2016, the day Kayla and Charlie disappeared, this is what actually happened. Kayla and Charlie pulled up to the entrance of Todd's property expecting a day of yard work. And Kohlhepp told them he needed to unlock the front gate first. So they followed his vehicle through, and after they drove through, Kohlhepp secured the gate so no one could get in or out. And Kayla didn't think anything of it, because they had worked for Kohlhepp several times before. So the three of them kept driving, and a 2-story garage came into view first, and then a metal shipping container sitting off the side. And inside the garage, Kohlhepp handed them each a bottle of water and a pair of hedge clippers, and he told them he'd walk them out to the trail where he wanted it to be cleared. So they stepped outside, and then Kohlhepp paused and said he'd forgotten something, so he went back inside by himself. And Kayla and Charlie would just stand together in the quiet, hand in hand. And a few minutes would pass, and then Kohlhepp came back through the door, but now he was holding a gun. And he didn't say a word, but 3 rounds would hit Charlie in the chest. And Kohlhepp was completely calm. And after he shot Charlie, he would swing around toward Kayla, and he would take her by the hand and order her into the garage. And he would tell her if she didn't, she would join Charlie. So once they were inside, he shoved her down. Metal cuffs went around her wrists first, and then her ankles. And after that, he forced a ball gag between her teeth, and then he stood up and told her he had to go deal with Charlie. And meanwhile, at this point in time, the outside world hadn't noticed a thing. And Kayla's phone stopped sending replies on August 31st, as we know, and Charlie's went dark around the same time. So for the first couple of days, nobody panicked. But the days kept passing, and neither one of them came back. And Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver were now gone. And while the people who loved them were beginning to realize something was wrong, Kayla was already locked up inside a shipping container less than an hour's drive away. So that first day, after Kohlhepp handcuffed and gagged Kayla, he took Kayla to that storage container sitting on the property. And it was 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, but pitch black inside. And a chain also went around her neck, and he fastened it to the wall at the back of the container. And then he chained her ankle in the opposite corner. And the length of the chain around her neck was 2.5, maybe 3 feet long. So essentially, she was shackled in this container like a dog. So at this point in time, she's realizing that she's a prisoner and also dealing with the fact that the love of her life just died in front of her. And at some point afterward, Kayla caught sight of Charlie's body. It had been rolled into a blue tarp, and he put Charlie in the ground. And Kayla didn't know where, and Charlie's car vanished along with him. Kohlhepp changed its color from white to brown with spray paint, and then drove it into the woods and buried it under branches until it was very difficult to see. And Kohlhepp killed Charlie to just take him away from Kayla and to more easily control her. But Charlie Carver was dead before the afternoon was over, and there were rations stacked inside the container and bottles of water, but that was it. No light, no ventilation beyond whatever crept through the metal seams. And it was late August in South Carolina, and the heat inside that box was suffocating. I can't even imagine. She was alone in the dark for hours before he showed up again. And he would tell her that if she tried to run, he would kill her. And if she tried to hurt him, he would kill her. And if she ever fought back, he would kill her. So Todd Kohlhepp would come back after disposing of Charlie and his car, and he would repeatedly Kayla. And this was just the first day. But Kayla would spend her captivity on 2 thin dog beds pushed against the wall of the container, and she would eat crackers and peanut butter and cheese that was sometimes moldy. And when she needed a bathroom, all she had was a 5-gallon bucket. And Kallep had placed an air freshener on the lid. And for the first 7 days, the heat inside the metal box was so brutal that she stripped down to her bra and underwear just to breathe. And once fall arrived and the air inside the container turned cold, he showed up with sweatpants and yoga pants for her to wear. And Kallep gave her things to pass the time, like books and coloring books made for adults, and a small MP3 player loaded with music, and small comforts designed to make a cage feel like something less than a cage. But his routine would never change. 2 times every day, he'd unlock the container and give her between 30 to 45 minutes outside of it. And those breaks happened in a 2-story garage on the grounds. And she was allowed food there and, on some visits, access to an actual toilet. But every second day, he handed her a small basin of water, and that was as close to bathing as she got, because there was no bathtub. And she was never fully unchained during any of this. He would just consistently put more chains on as he took her off the other chains, always keeping her chained up. And every single day, he would rape her, often multiple times a day. Which is just, the level of evil in this man is unprecedented. It's just absolutely disgusting. And at one point, he dragged her across the property to show her something, and it was 3 mounds of earth that looked like graves. And he would tell her, "Kayla, if you try to escape, you're going directly in one of those graves." But the threats weren't the only tool he used. He would tell Kayla she was beautiful, that she was smart, that he'd chosen her specifically. He would sit her down and explain Stockholm Syndrome to her by name. He would tell her that the happiness would kick in and they would be happy together at some point. Just absolutely delusional, ludicrous. And he laid out plans for a room with soundproofed walls, and that's where she would be kept long term. And he told her that someday, if she proved herself loyal, the entire property would be open to her, all 95 acres. And then, in the same breath, he'd remind her that nothing about her survival was guaranteed. But as long as she served her purpose, she would be safe. And he would just brag constantly about how many people he'd actually killed and about how skilled he was at it. And he described a woman named Megan. And she'd been locked up on the same property. The Megan we talked about before that worked at the restaurant. And eventually, he murdered her as well. And he claimed his body count was close to 100. And those people he killed meant nothing to him. They were objects. There was one thing he struggled with, though: looking someone in the eye while he did it. If a person was staring straight at him, he said he couldn't quite pull the trigger. And he also told her about other targets: a woman named Holly and Holly's boyfriend. And Kallep said he was planning to kill them both if he could figure out a way to get them alone. And through all of it, Kallep kept telling Kayla that nobody was coming. And he just minimized everything and made her feel so small and just forgotten. And he just told her no one was looking for you anymore, and that the world had just moved on without her. But Kayla didn't believe him. And she would soon figure out that survival meant making Kallep think he was in total control. And about a month in, something shifted. And Kallep had made his terms clear from the beginning. No escape attempts, no resistance, and she lives. So 4 weeks in, Kayla finally believed him. And that realization didn't make her compliant. He was not going to kill her, not as long as she played along. And if he wasn't going to kill her, then he couldn't take anything from her that she didn't hand over. It made her dangerous. So in those weeks, there were only 2 occasions where she saw anything beyond the garage or the inside of a metal box. And once, he chained her to a 4-wheeler and drove her around part of the property. And after weeks in total darkness, with barely enough room to shift positions, being outdoors felt like something close to grace. Because every day inside the container, she would talk to God. And no matter what Kallep told her, she held on to the certainty that people on the outside were searching. And there were moments where the weight of everything pressed in close enough to break her. So Anderson PD's position from day one was that nothing pointed to a crime, even with the abandoned apartment, even with the dog, even with 2 cell phones that went dead on the same day. The official line was non-committal. And they couldn't say it was a crime at this point, but they couldn't say it wasn't. Behind the scenes, though, they were pulling data. And according to Police Chief Jim Stewart, they had a ping request running on Kayla's phone within 48 hours of the missing persons report. And the phone pinged somewhere in Spartanburg County, and then it went dark. 2 days. That was all they got. So a request for the couple's cell phone records went out on September 9th, and those records didn't come back until September 22nd. But the data told a clear story. On August 31st, both phones hit the same tower, and after that, neither phone registered again. Still, a ping in a rural area doesn't hand you an address. It just gives you a radius. And without more, investigators couldn't really act on it. So Lieutenant Mike Akins was honest about where the case stood, saying, quote, "We tracked down the leads we had, but there isn't very much," unquote. And one trail they did follow was Nicole Carver, Charlie's estranged wife. Because on September 6th, investigators went to speak with her, and Nicole told detectives the apartment door had been unlocked and she'd let herself in. And she walked out with Charlie's computer and Romeo, Kayla's Pomeranian. And according to Nicole, Charlie's browser history had Myrtle Beach searches in it. And detectives had heard through other sources that Nicole claimed Charlie's car was parked at her place with mechanical problems. And they asked to see it, but they didn't find it there. And on September 11th, Joanne brought detectives a set of messages, and she said Nicole had sent them. And one claimed Charlie had called Nicole from a hospital in Myrtle Beach, and another said his car had turned up at the Greenville-Spartanburg International Airport. And investigators chased both leads, but both would come up empty. And September 21st brought a different kind of lead, because a caller tipped off police about suspicious posts going up on Charlie's Facebook account, as we know. And this time, it wasn't just memes and fake milestones. Someone was using Charlie's account to DM people. And the messages said he was doing fine and asked for cash to be sent to Nicole, his ex. And officers traced the IP address behind the activity, and it led to Nicole Carver's home. So one trail kept looping back to the same person, but it never connected to any answer. And there was another problem, because despite the bizarre Facebook activity, despite private messages being sent from a missing man's account, Anderson police had not sought a warrant from Facebook. And Lieutenant Dave Creamer acknowledged as much to the Daily Beast, saying, quote, "To do anything like that, we'd have to issue a search warrant to Facebook. I don't know if we've done that, but I'm pretty sure we have not done that," unquote. And over a month into the investigation, they still hadn't. And dozens of tips poured in over those weeks, and people called in claiming they'd seen Kayla or Charlie or the Grand Prix. And some passed along spots the couple used to frequent, but none of them led anywhere. And then, on October 13th, something different came in. And the friend who'd filed Kayla's missing persons report came back to the police, because she had something new. A second-hand tip from someone else. And his claim was specific, because he said he'd run into Kayla the day before she vanished, and that her body was on a 100-acre parcel somewhere in Spartanburg County. 100 acres in Spartanburg County, and a body. So investigators went to Kayla's Facebook page and, with a search warrant, combed through her messages. And inside her messages was a thread with Charlie, and they'd been making plans to meet someone named Todd Kohlhepp on August 31st. And he lived in Moore and was supposed to bring them out to a property for work. And when they ran Kohlhepp's name, a 95-acre property in Woodruff, South Carolina, came back under his ownership. Everything clicked at once. And Kayla's phone had last pinged off a cell tower in Spartanburg County. And the Facebook messages placed her with Kohlhepp on the same day she vanished. And his property sat within the range of that tower. And on top of all of it, as we know, Todd Kohlhepp was a registered sex offender. And for 6 weeks, Anderson PD had been running the investigation as a local case. It wasn't until mid-October that they understood the trail led into Spartanburg County. So on October 18th, Spartanburg County Sergeant Brandon Letterman got a phone call. Quote, "You need to meet with these detectives from Anderson." I said, "Okay, for what?" "They've got a missing persons case that might lead up here. They are here now," unquote. So they walked Letterman through the whole picture. 2 people who vanished on August 31st. Cell data placing both of them near Woodruff that same day, and a tip claiming someone was buried on a large rural property in his county. Letterman checked the map, and there was only one property that size within 2 miles of the cell tower, and it belonged to Todd Kohlhepp. So they moved fast after that, and they subpoenaed Kohlhepp's phone data, and it showed his cell hitting the same tower as Kayla's and Charlie's phone on the day they disappeared. And the sheriff's office sent aerial surveillance over that same property the same day, and first a drone, and then a helicopter. And dense forest swallowed everything below, though, so they really didn't see anything. And 2 weeks later, why was it 2 weeks later? What is going on? Letterman's court order for Kohlhepp's full cell records came through, and the records backed up what they already believed. Kohlhepp's phone and Kayla's were pinging off the same tower on August 31st, right around the same time she went silent. And combined with everything else, it gave them probable cause for a search warrant. So on November 3rd, 2016, 2 teams deployed at the same time. A 3-person team headed to Kohlhepp's house on Windsong Way in Moore, and 1 detective from Anderson, 2 from Spartanburg County, and the rest converged on the Woodruff property. And at the house, they'd sit across from Kohlhepp and start picking apart his story. And at the property, they'd start cutting through locks. And he didn't know it yet, but both halves of his life were about to collapse at the exact same moment. So on November 3rd, 2016, the search party hit Kohlhepp's Woodruff property around 8:30 in the morning. And they would go to the barn first. And on the second floor, in a loft that had been converted into a crude apartment, they found a U-bolt chains fastened around a bed frame. But nobody was there. But the chains told them they were in the right place. So they moved onto the shipping container. And it was green, metal, and sealed tight. And one of the deputies brought a sledgehammer down on the lock, holding the container shut. And from inside, someone screamed, "Help." And Spartanburg County Sheriff Chuck Wright was miles away when the call came in. He didn't hesitate. Quote, "I got there in 6 minutes. It was 25 minutes away, and I made it in 6, unquote. And by the time Wright arrived, his deputies were already working on the container door, and 5 separate locks held it shut, and they cut through every one. And body cam footage shows them pushing inside, and flashlight beams cutting through pitch black, weapons up, shelves lined the walls, plastic water bottles by the case, and supplies stacked everywhere. Something that looked like a cage sat in the middle of the space, all the way to the back of the bin. And there was Kayla Brown. 65 days after she vanished, a chain ran from her neck to the wall. And her ankle was locked in a separate shackle, and she had on glasses and a black shirt, gray pants, and sandals, like she'd been dressed for a normal day that never ended. And she was surrounded by the remnants of her captivity. Dog beds, a bucket with an air freshener sitting on top, crackers, books, and coloring books, that MP3 player. And when rescuers asked about Charlie, Kayla didn't hesitate, and she said, "We shot him." And then, while deputies were still working to unchain her, she gave them everything.
Todd Kohlhepp shot Charlie Carver 3 times in the chest, wrapped him in a blue tarp, put him in the bucket of the tractor, locked me down here, and I never seen him again. He says he's dead and buried. He says there's several bodies dead and buried out here.
And when the questioning was done, she began to cry. And she told them Kohlhepp had shot her boyfriend because of her, so they would get the chains off of her, and someone wrapped a towel around her. And then they walked her out into the open air, and it was the first sunlight she'd seen in more than 2 months. And Detective Bradley Whitefield of Anderson City Police Department was one of the first people to reach her, saying, quote unquote, "I was shocked and amazed." And Detective Charlin Ezel was right beside him. And Kayla looked at her and said, quote, "Thank you so much for finding me," unquote. And Whitfield broke down later when he tried to describe what he'd witnessed that day, saying, quote, "I think we all saw a lot of things that day that are going to stay with us," unquote. And Kayla described that moment from her side of the container wall, saying, quote, "I think it was 9 o'clock. I start hearing noises, and then I heard somebody's voice, and I couldn't say anything. I couldn't breathe, like I panicked. Somebody came up and asked if I was in there. They said, 'We're going to get you out,' unquote." And on the way to the hospital, Kayla kept talking. And in the ambulance, she started giving up what Kallep had told her, a husband and wife he'd murdered before she was ever taken. And then she told them something bigger. 4 people gunned down inside a motorcycle dealership in Spartanburg County. Nobody had ever been arrested, and that was 13 years ago. That shooting we talked about previously. And Sheriff Wright spoke to reporters that evening. Kayla was alive and well, he would say, but she was obviously traumatized. And when pressed again on her condition later that night, he offered a small consolation. And he told reporters she was in good spirits and that she looked good for someone who'd spent 65 days in a metal box. And Wright credited 2 things for the outcome. Finding Kayla, he said, came down to divine intervention from God himself, and the rest, he said, was good investigative work, the kind that put boots on the right piece of ground. And Dan Heron, the family friend who'd been searching for Kayla since Labor Day, learned the news the way most people learn impossible things, just out of nowhere. Quote, "I found out they were missing on Labor Day weekend. After searching for her for 2 months, I then got a text message from another good friend of mine, and she said they found Kayla. She's alive," unquote. And Kayla's family released a statement through In Missing Pieces Network the next day. Physically, she was doing well, but on the emotional side, it was a different story. Quote unquote, "Good moments and bad moments. I can't even imagine, my God." And they would ask for privacy, saying, quote, "Right now, Kayla needs time to process and begin to cope with the events that have occurred," unquote. So while Kayla was being pulled from that container, Todd was sitting in his living room on Winsong Way in Moore, talking to a different set of investigators. And they'd shown up that morning to ask about his cell phone. And the conversation started politely. And at that point, neither side knew what the other team had just found. And then the phone calls started coming in. And updates started filtering in from the team out in Woodruff. And each call changed the temperature in the room. And the tone in the room shifted. And they cuffed him. And then they told him what his colleagues had just pulled out of that container.
"My sergeant served a search warrant on your property. We have Kayla. Excuse me? She was locked in a container. She has told us that you shot and killed Charlie. You're under arrest right now for kidnapping. All right? They're continuing to search your property. They're going to continue. They got cadaver dogs down there. Okay?
And when asked directly why he shot Charlie, he answered, quote unquote, "I didn't shoot anybody, sir." And they asked about the container, about why a woman was chained inside it on his property, and he had no answer at that time. And he asked for a lawyer. And the arrest happened just before 2 p.m. on November 3rd, 2016. And Kallep was taken into custody at his own home. And back on the property, investigators began tearing the place apart. And they found Charlie's formerly white sedan in the woods, and they found Charlie's grave. And a tattoo on his shoulder confirmed it was Charlie. And the coroner's report told the rest, his multiple gunshot wounds all clustered in his upper body. And over the next few days, they found more. And investigators kept digging. And on November 6th, they recovered a body. And on November 7th, another. And they belonged to a husband and a wife. Johnny Joe Coxey, 29 years old, and Megan Lee McCraw Coxey, who was 25 years old. And the couple had been reported missing on December 22nd, 2015, out in Spartanburg. And the Coxeys had been standing on the corner of Reedville and Blackstock Road, panhandling, when Kallep pulled up and offered them a job on his land. And both had extensive tattoos. And that's how the coroner was able to identify them. And the coroner's findings told 2 different stories. Johnny died first, a bullet to the torso, and Megan survived him by about a week, alone on that property with the man who killed her husband. And she was killed on Christmas Day, or the day after, with a single gunshot wound to the head. And Kallep later explained the gap. He shot Coxey on the spot, and McCraw Coxey he tried to keep, just the same pattern he tried to repeat with Kayla. And his reason was that she'd tried to burn her way out. because he'd given her cigarettes and she used them to start a fire inside of the container. So 3 bodies total recovered from the 95 acres, along with a stockpile of weapons that shouldn't have existed. Suppressed 9mm semi-auto rifles and ammunition. So much of it that no one even tried to tally the count. And not one firearm on the property had a background check tied to Kohlhepp's name. As we know, his friend bought them for him, so obviously they wouldn't be tied to Kohlhepp. And every weapon on the property had been obtained illegally. And upstairs in the second-floor living area Kohlhepp had built for himself, investigators opened the top drawer of a dresser, and inside they would find a set of handcuffs. Now, Kohlhepp asked for an attorney the day he was arrested, but 2 days later, on November 5th, he changed his mind, and he contacted Tommy Clark and Mark Gaddy himself. No lawyer and no conditions, just a willingness to talk. And he rode out to the Woodruff property with the 2 detectives and showed them where the bodies were buried. And his price for cooperating was small and specific. He wanted to talk to his mommy, and he wanted to give her a picture. And he wanted to transfer money into the college fund of a friend's child. And in exchange, he gave up everything. And he confessed to the mass shooting at Superbike Motorsports in 2003, the cold case that had haunted Spartanburg County for 13 years. Just 4 people executed inside a motorcycle dealership and not a single arrest. And his account of Superbike included information no one outside the investigation had ever heard. And Sheriff Wright put it bluntly, saying, quote, "He told us some stuff that nobody ought to know," unquote. And he described going back through the building after the initial shots and putting a single round into the forehead of every victim. Quote, "I proceeded to walk back into the building again to clear, and I went. I put 1 round in each person's forehead," unquote. And in interrogation footage, his demeanor was absolutely chilling. And he spoke about the massacre with the detachment of someone reviewing, game tape.
So it's like, at that point, it's almost like a video game. It's not a game, but it's almost like you're focused on, you've been there, sir. You know what I'm talking about.
My golf game is weak. My kill game is strong.
Jesus. Just throw him in a deep, dark hole. But he laughed after the last one, and he bragged about the precautions he'd taken to avoid being caught. Every round he loaded into that weapon, he did it wearing gloves. And that way, no prints would end up on the brass. And when it was over, he disassembled the gun. Each piece went into a separate trash can, and he buried the barrel at the bottom of a bag of dirty cat litter. And for 13 years, that was enough. Investigators had actually known his name the entire time. Kohlhepp was a former Superbike customer. And 10 years after the killings, his name came up on a mailing list. And the mailing list was for former customers. A detective sent out a generic letter in 2013, hoping someone might talk, but obviously he never responded. Melissa Ponder was living in Arizona by then. Just 13 years of silence. And then her phone rang, and it was a detective from the original Superbike investigation, and he told her about the arrest, and the detective told her something she'd waited 13 years to hear. The man in custody knew things about the murders that had never been shared outside that investigation. So 13 years of silence broken in a single phone call. And as the scope of his confessions widened, so did the contradictions. And inside the container, Kohlhepp had told Kayla he killed Charlie for control. And in those first hours after rescue, Kayla told investigators something different, that Kohlhepp had been, quote-unquote, mad at her. And Kohlhepp's mother offered yet another version. According to her, Charlie's mouth got him killed, because he had a really smart mouth, she said, and that was something her son would never let slide. And in his own confession, Kohlhepp gave a 4th explanation.
I don't know how to answer that, honestly. I was angry at her, I was angry at him. It just went very quickly.
So 4 different versions, and none of them agree. But Kohlhepp wasn't done talking, and his mother came to see him after the arrest. And he told her the body count was higher than investigators had found. And she asked, how many? Quote, "You do not have enough fingers," unquote. And he claimed he'd shot a man in Arizona when he was 14. And Tempe PD started pulling cold case files and 30 years worth of unsolved killings looking for anything that might match. But beyond the basic claim, he had almost nothing to offer. No names, no specifics, no charges ever came from it. But after the arrest, journalists began combing through Kohlhepp's digital footprint, and someone had been leaving product reviews on Amazon for years, and the account was registered under the name Me, and the wish list attached to it carried a different name, Todd Kohlhepp. And the first review went up in 2014. The same year, Kohlhepp bought the 95 acres. And there were 140 of them, and the products ranged from tactical gear and weapon accessories to field medical kits and books on sniping, rappelling, and battlefield surgery, and a shopping list for someone preparing for war. And the reviews included one about a lock stating, quote-unquote, "Solid locks, have 5 on a shipping container, won't stop them, but sure will slow them down till they are too old to care." That is so incredibly disgusting and disturbing that an Amazon review, a serial killer, is putting up Amazon reviews about a victim. Just, oh my God. It makes my stomach turn. Holy shit. But these reviews would later earn him the nickname Amazon Review Killer. But before the weekend was over, the state had 4 new murder charges on the books, and all of them tied to the 2003 Superbike Motorsports killings after 13 years of dead ends, solved because a woman in a shipping container refused to die. So on May 26, 2017, Todd Kohlhepp stood in Spartanburg County courtroom and pleaded guilty. 7 counts of murder, 4 counts of possessing a weapon during a violent crime, and 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and 14 charges in all. And the sentence came down the same day. 17 consecutive life terms without parole. Plus 30 years for the kidnapping of Kayla Brown. Plus 30 more for assault, all running back to back. Every piece of it was negotiated in advance, and the solicitor put everything on paper, and the agreement ran 9 pages long, and everyone involved signed it. Kohlhepp, his lawyers, solicitor Barry Barnett, Kayla Brown, a representative for each of the 7 murder victims, Sheriff Wright, and an attorney from the South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services. And under the terms, Kohlhepp gave up his right to appeal in any court, state, or federal. And parole was off the table permanently, thank God, and he couldn't seek it. And if someone offered it anyway, the agreement required him to turn it down. So there's no way this guy's getting out of jail. And one more clause sat at the bottom. Any escape attempt, any violation of any term, and the whole agreement dissolved. And the state could then re-sentence him on every charge and put the death penalty back in play. Which raised the obvious question, why not seek it from the start? Well, Barnett addressed that directly, saying, quote, Todd Kohlhepp deserves the death penalty. But the reality of the situation is that our state doesn't have a functioning death penalty. The last execution occurred in 2011, and the state's supply of lethal injection drugs expired shortly thereafter, unquote. So it was a practical calculation wrapped in an ugly truth. The plea spared Kayla from testifying on the stand, thank goodness, and it spared the families of 7 victims from years of appeals. And it meant that Kohlhepp's confessions to the Superbike killings, the cold case that had hollowed out a community for 13 years, would finally stand as a matter of legal record. And the families showed up, and they filled the benches in the courtroom and waited for the words they'd spent years needing to hear. And one of Megan McCraw-Coxey's family members stood and addressed the court, saying, quote, today is not so much his day in court as it is Megan's day of justice and retribution, unquote. And he said he could never forgive Kohlhepp. Not today, not ever. And Kayla was also there, and her legal team told the court she'd planned to be there, and she wanted to look at Kohlhepp directly. But post-traumatic stress disorder kept her away, and she agreed with the plea deal. And her message to the court was delivered through her legal team. Quote unquote, he's the killer, not me. And after the criminal proceedings closed, the civil cases began. And Kayla went after Kohlhepp's estate in civil court, and the complaint listed kidnapping, assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligence. And the initial filing asked for $360 million. And that number accounted for everything, including medical costs, the pain she'd endured, and the emotional wreckage, and the future she'd been robbed of. And when Kohlhepp didn't respond to the filing, the court entered a default judgment, and the award totaled $6.3 million, roughly $1.5 million in actual damages and $4.7 million in punitive damages. And her attorney put it in perspective, saying, quote, no amount of money will ever compensate Kayla for what Todd Kohlhepp did to her, unquote. And Charlie's dad, Chuck, filed a wrongful death suit of his own. And Cindy Coxey, the mother of Johnny Coxey, filed another. And the families of the Superbike victims filed theirs as well. And in December of 2018, the Superbike families came face-to-face with KallMeKris during a civil damages hearing. And Thomas Lucas, Brian's father, tried to describe what 15 years of grief felt like, saying, quote, "We have some answers, we have some information, but the pure heartache never goes away," unquote. And Lorraine Lucas, Brian's mother, refused to look away, saying, quote, "I'm not afraid to stare him down. He took my son's life and the life of 3 other people for whatever stupidity. He gave me eye contact. I'm sure my eyes said everything that was in my heart," unquote. And to pay for those judgments, KallMeKris's assets were liquidated and his personal belongings went up for auction. And over 550 items in total, power tools, gas cans, rain barrels, books, a gun safe, an ATV, even a handcuff key. Every item was sold. Nothing was left on the table. And the 95-acre property was sold separately in a foreclosure auction. And every dollar raised was directed towards settlement payouts for the people KallMeKris had destroyed. But Chuck, Charlie's dad, watched the bidding and felt something other than justice. The idea of strangers collecting objects connected to his son's murder made no sense to him. And some buyers said the money was their way of helping the families, but Chuck wasn't buying it. And he figured most of those people would turn around and resell what they'd bought. So 3 months before the plea deal, Kayla Brown sat across from Dr. Phil McGraw for a 2-part interview that aired on February 13th and 14th, 2017. And it was her first time telling the story on national television. And she did not flinch. Quote, "No matter what he did to me, he did not break me. He could not destroy who I am, and I won," unquote. And she talked about Charlie, saying, quote, "I'll always miss Charlie. I'll always wonder what our life would have looked like. But as far as what Todd did to me, I am not going to let that man rule my life," unquote. And at one point in the interview, Dr. Phil asked the question directly, had she thought about ending things in that container? And Kayla said Charlie's face and the image of her mother waiting at home shut that door before it could open. And she described the moment rescue stopped feeling like a dream and started feeling real, saying, quote, "I didn't feel safe until I had Mama in my arms," unquote. And the public saw someone just incredibly strong, someone unbroken. But what they couldn't see is that survival doesn't end when the locks come off. And in the months that followed her rescue, Kayla began seeing a man named Adam Mason. And they would get engaged, but the wedding would never happen because Adam stabbed in the chest at his home. Oh my God, Jesus Christ. And he was rushed to the hospital, but went into cardiac arrest and didn't survive. And later, she began dating James Devin Moore. And in July of 2019, both were arrested on domestic assault charges. And when the Greenville News reached out, Kayla's spokesperson, Jenny Dial, said she had stopped taking her medication before the incident. And after that, the headlines stopped. And after 2019, she stepped back from all of it. No interviews, no public appearances. Almost nothing is known now about where she is or what she's doing. Because trauma doesn't follow a straight line. And it doesn't resolve on schedule or dissolve under bright lights. The domestic incident was not excusable, but it doesn't erase what she endured. And it confirms how deep the damage went. And Charlie's family buried him in a different way. And his memorial service was held on November 19th, 2016 at North Anderson Baptist Church. And it was the day he would have turned 33. And the people who came to the service remembered a man who worked at a tissue factory and dreamed bigger than his paycheck allowed. A pool player who competed in leagues around town, a veteran of the National Guard, and an author with 4 completed mysteries behind him. And a 5th nearly done that never got finished. And a son whose father said he'd hand you whatever he had. And what this case peeled back was something most people would rather not look at. Because how does a man with a felony kidnapping conviction and a spot on the registry walk into a licensing office and walk out a real estate agent? One question on the application stood between Todd KallMeKris and a professional career. And he lied, and nobody checked. But Todd KallMeKris is serving 7 consecutive life sentences. He cannot appeal, he cannot seek parole, and if those terms feel redundant, they were meant to be. Because for years after his conviction, he was housed at Broad River Correctional Institution, and that changed in June 2025. And Fox Carolina ran an investigation into what KallMeKris had been up to behind bars, and the findings got him shipped to Kirkland Correctional Institution, a supermax facility, on an indefinite basis. And he'd been selling merchandise, t-shirts stamped with the letters SKTK, serial killer Todd Kohlhepp. And on top of that, he'd been talking to a producer who he wanted to help him package his story for an audience. And he'd been sent autographed confession documents, autopsy reports of his own victims, which is disgusting, and a signed Superbike Motorsports business card to a woman outside the prison with instructions to sell them. And people were paying up to $65 a pop for that kind of material on a website that trade in serial killer memorabilia. And none of this was on the Department of Corrections' radar. It took a Fox Carolina news team bringing the evidence to their attention before anyone inside the system realized what was happening. And Kohlhepp lost his tablet privileges indefinitely, and South Carolina's Inspector General got involved too, looking into whether profiting off the murders could land Kohlhepp with new criminal charges. And state law in South Carolina makes it illegal for a prisoner to earn money from acts that put them behind bars. And he told investigators there were more victims, but he wouldn't say how many, and he wouldn't say where. So investigators wanted him to walk them to the graves, but he wouldn't do it. And a search of the property turned up nothing, and Spartanburg County called it off. And Wright drew a line. And his department was done digging until Kohlhepp gave them real information they could actually check. He wasn't going to let a man in a cage control the narrative from behind concrete walls. There may be names that haven't been spoken yet. Families somewhere in Arizona, in South Carolina, in places no one has thought to look, still waiting for someone who never came home. And nearly a decade later, he says he wished he'd held the line. Quote, "Had I known 9 or 10 years later that we would still be doing the same thing, I should have stuck to my guns and said, no, I'm not signing that agreement," unquote. But the story was never about him. It was about the people he took. Charles David Charlie Carver, Scott Dean Ponder, Beverly Elaine Guy, Brian Thomas Lucas, Christopher Michael Shuby Sherbert, Johnny Joe Coxey, Megan Lee McCraw Coxey, and Kayla Brown. And that is it for this case. Let me know what other cases you would like me to deep dive into down below. I always read the comments, and until next time, stay beautiful and stay safe. And a big fuck you, you piece of shit, to Todd Kohlhepp. See you in the next one.